Hello there and welcome to History for Lunatics. I am very glad you are here tonight. Settle in wherever you are. Maybe you are listening from bed with the room already dark, maybe from a couch with one lamp still on, maybe from a kitchen where everyone else has gone quiet and the day has finally loosened its grip a little. Wherever you are, I want you to take one small look around your own world for a moment. Because tonight we're going back to a time when the ordinary act of living among other people came with rules so specific, so constant, and sometimes so strange that a simple walk down a street could feel almost like passing through a test you had not studied for. We're not beginning with a king signing a treaty. We are not beginning with a famous battle, a revolution, or a grand ballroom filled with powdered wigs and music. We are beginning with something much smaller and, in a way, much more revealing. We are beginning with manners. Not the simple kind your grandmother may have reminded you about. Elbows off the table, say please, say thank you. Do not chew with your mouth open. Those are familiar enough. The social rules of the 1700s went deeper than that. They reached into how you stood, who you looked at when you were allowed to speak, what kind of hat you wore, how low you bowed, whether you walked on the left or the right, who entered a room first, who sat closest to the fire, who got served first at the table, and whether a young woman could cross a lane alone without giving half the town something to whisper about before supper. It is easy for us to laugh at some of this from a safe distance. We live in a world where someone can send a message to their boss using 3 words and an emoji. We can leave the house in clothes that would have caused a committee meeting in some 18th century villages. We can sit beside strangers without asking who outranks whom. We can walk into a shop, look the owner in the eye, ask a direct question, and leave without bowing to anyone. But in the 1700s, these small freedoms did not exist in the same way, because society was built on visible order. Everyone had a place, and other people expected you to know yours. That is the part that I want you to hold in mind tonight. Manners were not only about being pleasant, they were a public language. They told the world whether you were respectable, whether you were obedient, whether you understood rank, whether you had been raised properly, whether you could be trusted, whether your family had discipline, whether you were trying to rise above your station, and sometimes whether you were dangerous. A greeting was not only a greeting. A seat was not only a seat. A hat was not only a hat. A silence could be wise, and a single badly timed sentence could stain your reputation for years. Before we step fully into that world, let me ask you something simple. What time is it where you are right now, and where are you listening from? I always like imagining these stories travelling into bedrooms, living rooms, night buses, late kitchens, small apartments, quiet houses, and places I have never seen. It is a strange little comfort, thinking that while we talk about the past, people in completely different corners of the present are settling into the same old human habit of listening to a story in the dark. And if this kind of slow history speaks to you, if you find yourself enjoying the quiet details of ordinary life long after the famous names have left the page, it would mean a great deal if you liked the video and subscribed. You do not have to do it this second. Do it when something lands with you. Do it when a detail makes you stop and think, or when you realise that the past is not as distant as it first seemed. Tonight, we are walking into the 1700s through a door that most history books pass without noticing, and on the other side of that door, people are watching each other very carefully. Let us begin in a market town sometime around the middle of the 18th century. It might be in England, or in colonial America, or in a Dutch village, or a French provincial town. The exact place changes the details, but the basic pressure is familiar across much of the Atlantic world. The street is narrow, the buildings lean close to one another. There is mud in the road if it has rained recently, animal smells near the stable, smoke drifting from chimneys, carts creaking over rough ground, and people everywhere who know more about each other than modern people usually want their neighbours to know. In a town like this, privacy is limited. Your clothing is noticed. Your purchases are noticed. Your tone of voice is noticed. The hour you return home is noticed. If your daughter speaks too freely with a young man at the well, that is noticed. If your son forgets to remove his hat in front of a minister, that is noticed. If your wife appears in public dressed above what people think your household can afford, that is noticed too, and not kindly. The 1700s were filled with communities where reputation was a kind of currency, and unlike coins, it could be lost very quickly. To us, many of these rules look fussy. To them, they were part of how a community kept itself organised. The world did not yet have the kind of bureaucratic systems that modern people rely on without thinking. There were no identity cards in the ordinary sense, no digital records, no quick way to verify whether someone was who he said he was, no background checks for most daily dealings. People judged one another by signs. Did he speak with respect? Did she dress modestly? Did the children obey? Did the apprentice bow to his master? Did the servant keep his eyes lowered? Did the newcomer understand who deserved precedence? Manners became evidence. They were used to read a person. A man who failed at courtesy was not simply awkward. He might be proud, dishonest, poorly raised, or unstable. A woman who ignored the rules of modest conduct might not simply be independent. She might be judged careless, vain, or morally suspect. That sounds harsh, because it was harsh, but it was also normal. These judgments shaped marriages, work, church standing, credit, friendships, legal trust, and whether someone would help you when trouble came. Imagine, for a moment, that you are a young man in that town, perhaps 17 years old, apprenticed to a carpenter or a printer or a blacksmith. You're not a child anymore, but you're not fully your own master either. Your clothing is plain. Your hands show your trade. You know that when you meet your master in the street, you do not greet him like an equal. You remove your hat, or at the very least touch it properly. You use the correct form of address. You do not slap him on the back. Do not speak first unless the relationship allows it. Do not make jokes that suggest too much familiarity. If a gentleman passes by, you give way. If you are carrying tools and he is not, it does not matter that you are the one burdened. Rank moves first. Respect makes space. This was one of the clearest social rules of the period. People of lower rank yielded physically to people of higher rank. They stepped aside in doorways. They let them enter first. They surrendered the better seat, the warmer place, the higher position at table, the first word in conversation. We often talk about class in broad economic terms: land, money, property, inheritance. But in the 1700s, class also lived in these bodily habits. It was trained into muscle memory. A child learned it long before he could explain it. Stand when the right person enters. Lower your gaze when needed. Do not interrupt. Do not sit until you are invited. Do not presume. That last one may be the most important rule of all. Do not presume. So much of 18th century social life was built around stopping people from presuming too much, too soon, too visibly. Do not presume equality with your betters. Do not presume intimacy with someone you barely know. Do not presume a woman is available for conversation simply because she is in public. Do not presume you can dress like a gentleman because you have bought one fine coat. Do not presume you can speak bluntly just because what you're saying is true. Truth itself often had to wait its turn behind courtesy. There is something almost exhausting about that when we look at it now. Modern people are trained, at least in many places, to value directness. We say things like, just be honest, just say what you mean, just be yourself. In the 1700s, being yourself without restraint could be considered childish or offensive. A respectable person controlled the self. A respectable person filtered appetite, anger, laughter, desire, grief, and opinion through the rules of rank and reputation. You were not admired for blurting out your feelings. You were admired for governing them. Even laughter had rules. Loud laughter in the wrong setting could be seen as vulgar. Too much smiling at the wrong person could be read as flirtation. A careless compliment could create suspicion. A public insult could lead to a formal quarrel, and among gentlemen in some places, quarrels over honour could become very serious indeed. This is why conversation in polite society was treated almost like a craft. It had to be practiced. Young people from respectable families were taught not only what to say, but when to stop saying it. They were warned against boasting, contradicting superiors, speaking too loudly, whispering in company, asking impertinent questions, praising themselves, laughing at their own jokes, using coarse language, discussing bodily functions, leaning, sprawling, staring, fidgeting, and chewing in a way that drew attention. A courtesy manual was not a decorative little book meant to sit unread on a shelf. It was a map for survival in company. The famous rules of civility copied by George Washington as a young man belonged to this wider culture. They were not strange to him. They reflected a world in which a person's outer behaviour was supposed to reveal inner discipline. If you controlled your knife, your napkin, your posture, your voice, and your eyes, perhaps you could also control your temper, your pride, and your appetites. That was the theory, at least. Whether people actually managed it is another question, because the 1700s were full of people who failed constantly and then suffered for it in gossip. Gossip was the great enforcement system of everyday life. We tend to think of gossip as idle talk, unpleasant but not very powerful. In a small 18th century community, gossip could act almost like a court. It spread news of broken engagements, rude remarks, debt, drunkenness, vanity, laziness, bad housekeeping, disobedient children, suspicious courtship, sexual scandal, religious neglect, and public disrespect. You did not need to be formally punished to feel punished. You could simply become the person people discussed in lowered voices. And because marriage, employment, trade, and social support all depended on trust, gossip mattered. A girl known for bold behaviour might have fewer marriage prospects. A tradesman known for arrogance might lose customers. A servant known for answering back might struggle to find a new place. A family known for disorder might be quietly excluded from invitations. This is what made small rules so powerful. They were attached to consequences that could follow a person for years. Now think about entering a room. That sounds simple. You and I enter rooms all the time without considering it a social event. But in a respectable 18th century household, especially one with guests, entering a room had a pattern. You did not simply burst in and begin speaking. The order of entrance could matter. A person of higher rank might precede others. A gentleman removed his hat indoors. A bow or curtsy acknowledged the company. The depth and form of that bow depended on relative status. Too little respect could insult. Too much could look ridiculous or false. People watch these things because they understood them. There is a temptation to imagine everyone bowing and curtsying in a dramatic theatrical way all day long. But the truth was more practical and more constant. Small gestures carried meaning. A nod, a lowered head, a hand moved to the hat, a slight bend of the knee, a pause before sitting. All of these told the room that you understood the room. Not every home followed elite rules with the same strictness. A farm kitchen was not a royal court. A frontier settlement was not a London drawing room. A busy fish market didn't operate like a governor's dinner. But the idea beneath the rules travelled widely. People were unequal, and good conduct meant acknowledging that inequality in public. Even among people who were broadly similar in wealth, age and gender created layers. Elders ranked above youth. Husbands ranked above wives in law and custom. Parents ranked above children. Masters ranked above servants and apprentices. Ministers, magistrates, landowners, officers, and educated men often received deference whether or not they personally deserved it. That is one of the uncomfortable truths about manners in this period. They did not only make society smoother, they protected hierarchy. They taught people to perform obedience. They made inequality look orderly, even natural. And yet, because history is never one simple thing, These same manners could also protect people from chaos. In a crowded, tense, suspicious world, a shared code of behaviour gave everyone a script. You might dislike your neighbour, but you still knew how to greet him. You might resent your employer, but you knew the words expected in front of others. A young woman might feel afraid in public, but the rules of propriety gave her a language for refusing certain forms of approach. A poor man might not be respected as an equal, but if he behaved with proper dignity, he could still claim a kind of moral standing. Courtesy could be a cage, but it could also be a shield. That is why we need to take these rules seriously rather than simply laughing at them. They shaped real lives. They decided who was trusted, who was mocked, who was marriageable, who was respectable, who was remembered kindly, and who became a warning story told to children. One of the strangest parts to modernise is how early all of this began. Children in the 1700s were not generally treated as small private individuals with a right to express every feeling in public. They were expected to become orderly members of the household and community. A child who interrupted adults, grabbed food, sprawled in a chair, spoke loudly in company, or failed to greet a superior properly was not just being annoying. That child reflected badly on the parents. The child's behaviour suggested the household itself might lack discipline. Courtesy manuals for children could be severe. They taught children to stand in the presence of superiors, not to stare, not to answer rudely, not to speak when others were speaking, not to reach before being served, and not to treat adults as companions. The modern idea that children should be encouraged to voice preferences freely at every moment would have seemed odd, even dangerous to many families. A child's will was something to be shaped. Obedience was considered preparation for adulthood, not the opposite of it. If that sounds cold, it helps to remember the larger setting. Life was physically hard, households were economically fragile, and a disobedient child could create real problems. A boy who ignored instructions around animals, fire, water, tools, or strangers could put himself or others in danger. A girl who ignored rules of modesty could damage not only her own prospects, but her family's reputation. We may dislike the severity of the system, but we should understand why it felt necessary to those inside it. The social rules of the 1700s were not floating above life like decoration. They were tied to work, faith, money, marriage, safety, and survival. Consider clothing, because clothing was one of the clearest public signals a person carried. Today, we often dress to show personality. In the 1700s, clothing still expressed taste and identity, but it also announced rank, occupation, gender, wealth, respectability, and sometimes ambition. A servant in livery displayed the status of the household he served. A clergyman's dress signalled office. A widow's clothing marked her condition. A tradesman's apron identified his work. Fine silk, lace, embroidery, powdered hair, buckled shoes, stays, hoops, gloves, and hats all spoke before the wearer opened a mouth. There were older European traditions of sumptuary regulation, laws and customs that tried to control what different ranks could wear. And even where formal law weakened, social judgment remained strong. A person who dressed too far above his or her station could be accused of vanity or pretension. This did not mean people never tried. Of course they tried. People have always wanted to look better, richer, younger, more desirable, more important than circumstances allowed. That is one of the most human things in history. But in the 1700s, dressing upward could draw sharp notice. A maid with ribbons too fine for her wages, an apprentice with a gentleman's swagger, a merchant's wife dressed like aristocracy, a young man spending beyond his means on clothes while his debts grew, all of these could become topics of conversation. Clothing was not private expression in the way we often imagine it now. It was public evidence, and the public felt entitled to interpret it. Women carried an especially heavy burden in this visible world. Their conduct was watched not only as personal behaviour, but as a sign of family honour. A young unmarried woman could not move through society with the same freedom as a man without risk. Being seen alone with the wrong person, receiving letters too privately, speaking too warmly, laughing too openly, walking at certain hours or appearing in certain places could create talk. Courtship was surrounded by rules because marriage was not only romance, it was property, alliance, labour, inheritance, religion, and reputation joined together in one household decision. A couple might have affection, and many did, but affection had to pass through family approval, community expectations, economic reality, and proper public conduct. This is why chaperonage mattered. This is why doorways, parlours, gardens, churchyards, and visits became carefully watched spaces. The strangest thing to us may be that the rule was not simply do not do wrong, it was do not appear to do wrong. Appearance mattered because appearance created reputation, and reputation shaped reality. A harmless conversation could become harmful if enough people believed it meant something. That is a hard rule to live under. It requires constant self-monitoring. It teaches people to ask not only what am I doing, but what might this look like to others. Men were watched too, though often by different standards. A man's honour involved courage, truthfulness, financial responsibility, household control, religious seriousness, and public composure. Insult mattered, debt mattered, drunkenness mattered. Failure to govern one's wife, children, servants, or apprentices could make a man look weak. Too much softness could be mocked. Too much anger could be feared. A gentleman especially was expected to show command over himself. He was not supposed to shove, curse, spit, eat greedily, boast openly, or lose his temper like a common brawler, though many did. The rules were ideals, and real people are always messier than ideals. That is part of what makes this subject so interesting. The 1700s were not full of perfectly behaved figures moving through candlelit rooms like clockwork. They were full of tired mothers, restless children, proud fathers, ambitious apprentices, bored daughters, rude uncles, nervous suitors, gossiping neighbours, sharp-tongued widows, vain young men, careless servants, and people who knew the rules very well and broke them anyway. The rules matter because people failed against them. Without the rules, there is no scandal. With the rules, a dropped curtsy, a rude answer, a secret letter, or an improper seat at dinner could become a story. Let us return to that town street again, because by now the ordinary scene has changed. A woman crosses with a basket. She does not move randomly. She notices who is near. A young man approaching her may touch his hat but not stop her unless the acquaintance permits it. Two men meet outside a shop, and one gives a deeper bow because the other outranks him. A child is pulled back by the sleeve before he runs in front of a gentleman. A servant carrying a parcel lowers her eyes as she passes a group of women who know her mistress. A shopkeeper uses careful forms of address because politeness is good business. At the church door, people arrange themselves without needing a written chart, because everybody knows who should go ahead, who should wait, who is entitled to visible respect, and who must be content with less. The whole town is reading itself moment by moment. This is what I find most important about the strange social rules of the 1700s. They were not occasional. They were not saved for holidays or formal dinners. They lived in the body. They followed people from the table to the street, from the church pew to the marriage market, from the workplace to the family hearth. A person could not escape them by going home, because the home had rules too, and in many ways those were the strongest rules of all. The father's chair, the mother's labour, the child's silence, the servant's place, the order of serving, the blessing before food, the expectations around speech, posture, appetite, and obedience all turned an ordinary meal into a map of the household. The table was where rank became visible in the most familiar setting. Everyone had to eat. And because everyone had to eat, meals became one of the places where social order was rehearsed every day. We tend to imagine manners as something extra, something placed on top of life after the serious matters are done. In the 1700s, manners were one of the serious matters. They told you who you were allowed to be in front of others. They taught you when to lower your voice, when to lower your head, when to lower your expectations. They also gave people a way to move through a crowded world without constant open conflict. That is the tension we will keep meeting. These rules could be oppressive, and they could be useful. They could humiliate, and they could protect. They could keep a young woman safe from certain kinds of boldness, while also trapping her inside suspicion. They could teach a child discipline, while also silencing that child's ordinary needs. They could make a poor man appear respectable, while reminding him constantly that respect had a ceiling. They could make a dinner peaceful, while hiding who had no power at that table. And that is where we're going next. Into the room where the food has been set out, the seats are not chosen freely. The best place is already understood. The children know better than to reach, and every person around the table is about to show, without saying so directly, exactly where they belong. The table is already set before anyone sits down, and that matters more than it first appears. In a modern house, a table is usually a practical object. It is where people put plates, lean their elbows when no one is correcting them, pass the salt, check their phones under the edge, argue about small things, laugh too loudly, and sometimes eat in silence after a long day. The seats may be familiar, but they are not usually legal statements. Someone might have a favourite chair. Someone might always sit near the outlet or farthest from the kitchen. A child might slide into a parent's place just to be funny. In many homes now, if someone sits in the wrong seat, the worst that happens is a joke. In the 1700s, the table was not so casual. It was one of the clearest maps of authority inside the home. Before a word was spoken, before the blessing, before the first spoon entered the pot, the room had already explained itself. The person at the head mattered most. The person served first mattered most. The person who waited mattered less. The person standing behind the seated adults mattered even less than that. And everyone knew it. That is the part that feels strange to us, because the rules did not need to be announced. They were simply understood, repeated so often that they became part of the body. A child did not ask why father sat there. A servant did not ask why the family sat before him. A wife did not ask why she managed the food while the husband presided. A younger son did not ask why his older brother sat closer to the adults. The table taught these lessons 3 times a day, quietly, firmly, without needing a sermon every time. If you want to understand how people in the 1700s thought society was supposed to work, do not begin with a parliament or a courthouse. Begin in a kitchen, just after the evening meal is ready, when the fires drop to a steady glow and the household starts arranging itself around a piece of wood. Picture an ordinary home, not a grand manor with servants in polished livery and silver dishes under tall candles, but a middling or modest household, perhaps in colonial America, perhaps in England, perhaps in a provincial town where everyone knows which families are rising, which families are slipping, and which families are only pretending to be better off than they are. The table may be a long board set on trestles, or a heavy joined table that has been in the household for years. It may be plain, scratched, stained from use, burn-marked in one place from a careless ember, polished smooth in another from thousands of hands. There may not be individual chairs for everyone. Benches are common, stools are used. The best chair, if there is one, is not grabbed by the first person who reaches it. The best chair belongs to the person whose place in the household entitles him to it. The father, or male head of household, sits at the head. If the household includes an elderly father, a widowed mother, a visiting clergyman, a magistrate, or a guest of higher standing, the arrangement may shift, because precedence is not only about family, it is about rank. The room has to solve the problem of who counts most in this particular moment, and everyone present is expected to help solve it correctly. A mistake can embarrass the host. A deliberate mistake can insult someone. A careless mistake can reveal that you were not brought up properly. The wife's place is just as meaningful, though not equal in the same way. In many households she sits opposite her husband, or near the end from which she can manage serving, portioning, watching, correcting, and keeping the meal moving. This is one of those details that tells a larger truth about domestic life in the 1700s. The husband's authority is public, named, visible, defended by law and custom. The wife's authority is practical, constant, and often invisible until it fails. He presides. She operates the machinery. He may say the blessing. She has likely made sure there is food worth blessing. He may carve the meat if there is meat to carve, especially in a more formal household. She has stretched that meat across the day, planned the bread, counted the candles, kept the children from fighting, known which child is hungry, which servant is resentful, which pot is in danger of scorching, and which guest has been given too little attention. A dinner table in this world makes the father look like the centre of order, but the meal itself often depends on the mother's memory, labour, and timing. That tension is everywhere in 18th century domestic life. Authority and work are not always located in the same body. Now, look at the children. They are not scattered wherever they like. They are arranged according to age, usefulness, and expectation. The oldest children sit nearer the adults because they are closer to adult responsibility. Younger children sit lower down the table if they sit at all. In some households, especially stricter ones or ones shaped by older customs, children do not sit with the adults during the main meal. They stand, they wait, they receive what is given. This is one of those facts that modern listeners often find hard to accept, because we live in a time when family meals, at least in ideal form, are supposed to include children as little conversational members of the group. We ask them how their day was. We encourage them to speak. We let them explain things in long, winding sentences that may or may not have a destination. In the 1700s, many parents would have found that indulgent. A well-bred child was not a child who expressed every thought. A well-bred child was one who understood restraint. Children were expected to wait to be noticed. They were expected not to interrupt adult conversation. They were expected not to reach across the table, not to complain about food, not to ask for the best portion, not to stare at guests, not to speak with their mouths full, not to fidget in a way that drew attention, and not to forget that they were children. This was not merely about keeping the meal pleasant, it was training. The table was a classroom in obedience. A child learned rank by feeling it in the body, by waiting while others were served, by standing until allowed to sit, by watching the father take his place, by seeing the mother's eyes move across the room to catch misbehaviour before it became public. The rules were repeated until they became automatic. Sit straight. Keep still. Do not begin before your betters. Do not take the largest piece. Do not contradict. Do not speak when adults are speaking. Do not make noise with the spoon. Do not lick your fingers in company. Do not wipe your mouth on your sleeve if a cloth has been provided. Do not grab. Do not sprawl. Do not show greed. Greed was not only unpleasant, it suggested poor discipline. It suggested that appetite had beaten character, that mattered in a religious culture where self-command was treated as evidence of moral formation. The body at table was supposed to show the condition of the soul. The objects on the table carried their own rules. Many ordinary families did not use the kind of place settings we take for granted. Individual plates, matching forks, a full set of glasses and separate napkins for everyone were not standard in poorer households. Wooden trenchers, pewter dishes where affordable earthenware bowls, shared vessels, knives and spoons did much of the work. Forks existed, of course, and among wealthier families they became increasingly common through the 1700s. But in many ordinary homes they were still not as universal as a modern person imagines. The knife was personal and important. A person might bring his own. Spoons were used for pottage, porridge, stew, and soft foods. Hands still did more work than modern manners would allow, and that is why washing, wiping, and controlled movement mattered so much. Eating with the fingers was not automatically rude. Eating clumsily was rude. Dripping grease, grabbing, tearing food messily, reaching into a shared dish with obvious hunger, or leaving a mark on a shared vessel could all reveal a lack of training. A person who had no silver fork could still be mannerly. A person with fine silver could still behave like a brute. Then there is the salt. It is such a small thing, and yet for centuries it carried a weight that is almost comic to modern eyes. In older English dining custom, the salt cellar was not merely seasoning, it was a marker. To sit above the salt was to sit nearer the host in the place of honour. To sit below the salt was to occupy a lower place. By the 1700s, the exact force of this custom varied by region and household, but the idea remained familiar enough that people understood the phrase. Salt was valuable, necessary for preserving food, and symbolically tied to hospitality. Its position on the table could divide the important from the less important, without anyone needing to say a thing. Imagine that kind of table. Not a table where every seat is simply a seat, but a table where geography becomes judgment. Near the head, more status. Farther down, less. Near the good dishes, more attention. Near the scraps, less. The table is doing what society does outside the door. It is ranking bodies in space. Servants and apprentices complicate the picture, because they belong to the household but not to the family in the same way. In many 18th century homes, especially middling households that could not maintain a completely separate servants' hall, servants might eat in the kitchen, or after the family, or at the lower end of the same table, depending on local custom, wealth, and the relationship involved. Apprentices were especially interesting because they were often young, male, and bound into a household economy. An apprentice might live under his master's roof, eat his food, obey his rules, and learn his trade, but he was not a son. He was under authority. His place at table reminded him of that. Hired help, bound servants, enslaved people in colonial settings, and apprentices all experienced the table as a daily reminder of dependence. Who ate first, who ate last, who received leftovers, who cleared away, who could speak, who had to remain silent. These things were not accidental. They made hierarchy edible. In households that included enslaved people, especially in the American colonies and the Caribbean world, the table could become an even sharper display of power. Enslaved cooks prepared food they might not be permitted to eat in the same form. Enslaved attendants served diners who discussed liberty, religion, trade, and household virtue while being waited on by people denied legal freedom. That contradiction is not a footnote. It sat in the room. A genteel table in Virginia, South Carolina, or the West Indies could look orderly, refined and Christian to the guests gathered around it, while depending completely on coerced labour just beyond the edge of politeness. The more polished the ritual, the easier it was for those with power to pretend the order was natural. A table can reveal family structure, but it can also hide violence under linen. For ordinary free households, the meal usually began with prayer. This was not decoration. In many families, the blessing marked the father's spiritual authority, especially in Protestant households, where the head of the family was expected to lead domestic religion. Nobody began before grace. Children waited. Servants waited. A guest waited. The food sat there, cooling slightly, while the household acknowledged dependence on God. The prayer might be short in a busy home or longer in a pious one. A father might thank God for provision, ask protection over the household, remember the poor, ask forgiveness, or simply recite familiar words. What matters is that the blessing placed the meal inside a moral order. Food was not just food, it was providence, discipline, gratitude, hierarchy, and duty gathered into one daily act. To begin eating early was not only rude, it could be impious. After the prayer came the serving, and serving was another kind of language. The finest portion did not automatically go to the hungriest person. Hunger was not the ruling principle. Rank was. A guest of honour might be served first. The father might carve or distribute. The mother might ladle from the pot. In a poor family where food was limited, portioning required real judgment. The working man might receive more, because his labour demanded it. The small child might receive less, not necessarily from cruelty, but because the household counted calories by usefulness, age, and need as they understood them. The mother might take the worst piece without comment. Servants might receive what remained. In hard seasons, every spoonful carried calculation. A modern person may look at the table and see unfairness, and often it was unfair. But the people inside the room may have experienced it as an order. That is one of the difficult tasks of looking at the past honestly. We have to see the injustice without pretending the people living inside it always understood it by our terms. There is a particular silence that belongs to this kind of meal, not total silence necessarily. People did talk. Families joked, argued, whispered, prayed, corrected, and told news. But conversation was governed. A young person did not dominate. A wife's speech depended greatly on the household, the company, and the temperament of those present. Some women were sharp, funny, respected, and fully involved in the practical conversation of the table, especially in less formal homes where work made strict ceremony impossible. Others lived under husbands who expected quiet obedience. Guests changed the atmosphere. A family might speak freely when alone, then become carefully polished when a minister, employer, landlord, or prosperous neighbour sat with them. The presence of rank tightened the room. Everyone became a little more aware of hands, words, posture, and timing. The table was not only about eating, it was a performance of respectability. This is why Table Manners books spent so much time on the body. They told people not to scratch, not to spit, not to blow the nose loudly, not to gnaw bones in an ugly manner, not to put fingers into shared dishes unnecessarily, not to drink with food still in the mouth, not to lean too far over the dish, not to speak while chewing, not to stare, not to wipe greasy hands on the bread, not to take salt with a dirty knife, not to pick the teeth at table, not to make unpleasant noises, not to complain of the fare, and not to show disgust. Some of these rules sound familiar because we still have them. Others reveal a world where shared dishes, close quarters, limited washing, and bodily realities made manners a form of hygiene as well as status. To be polite was partly to protect others from your body. That may sound funny, but it is true. The 1700s did not have modern sanitation, modern dentistry, modern laundry, or modern personal space. People lived closer to smells, illness, dirt, and bodily functions than most of us do. Manners drew a boundary. They said, "I will control what can be controlled. I will not make my body a burden to the table." The napkin, where present, had rules too. Linen was not casual. Cloth took labour. A napkin could signal refinement, and its proper use showed training. You did not use it like a rag. You did not wipe the plate with it greedily. You did not blow your nose in it unless custom and necessity allowed something very different from what polite company preferred. In wealthier homes, table linen required washing, bleaching, drying, ironing, folding, storing, and protecting from stains, which meant every polished meal rested on domestic labour that continued long after the guests praised the hospitality and left. The clean table looked effortless because someone had worked to make effort disappear. That was true across the household. Good order was supposed to look natural. The woman of the house succeeded when the meal seemed smooth. The children behaved, the servants knew what to do, the food arrived in proper order, and no embarrassment broke through the surface. Visitors made everything more delicate. Hospitality in the 1700s was a serious obligation. A traveller, neighbour, minister, relative or business associate might be invited to eat, and the meal became an assessment of the household. Was the table generous? Was it wasteful? Was it clean? Were the children disciplined? Did the wife manage well? Did the husband preside with dignity? Did the servants obey? Did the family show proper religion? Did they try too hard to impress? A household could be judged for being stingy, but also for being showy. That balance is important. People admired generosity, but they distrusted vanity. A middling family that strained itself to imitate the gentry might be mocked. Too many fine dishes, too much display, too much imported tea, too much sugar, too much polished silver for a family whose debts were known to the town, and the meal could become evidence of foolish pride. The table had to show not only what you had, but that you knew how to have it properly. Tea deserves a moment here because by the 1700s, it had become one of the most socially loaded substances in the Atlantic world. Among families who could afford it, tea drinking carried rules of gentility, conversation, serving, and display. Tea tables allowed women, especially in middling and elite households, to exercise a particular kind of social authority. Cups, saucers, sugar bowls, teaspoons, and tea tables became objects of aspiration. But tea also exposed rank and politics. It was imported, taxed, fashionable, and sometimes controversial. A woman serving tea was not merely pouring a drink. She was displaying refinement, household management, access to goods, and knowledge of polite ritual. The same liquid could feel comforting in one room, pretentious in another, and politically charged in a third. That is how strange the social world of the 1700s can be. Even a cup of tea had a position in the argument over who people were. In poorer homes, the rules were less polished, but not absent. A family eating porridge from wooden bowls still knew order. A labourer's cottage might not have silver forks or a formal dining room, but children still waited, elders still received deference, guests still mattered, and the person who provided the food held authority. The meal might happen in the same room where people slept, worked, mended, stored tools, and warmed themselves by the fire. Smoke might hang near the rafters, a baby might fuss, a dog might nose too close to the bench and be pushed away. The floor might be dirt, brick, or rough boards. The dishes might be few. But the rules did not require luxury. A plain table could be just as hierarchical as a rich one, sometimes more so because in a small, hard household disorder had fewer cushions. If a child grabbed too much, someone else got less. If a servant answered back, the master's authority was threatened in a room where authority was one of the few forms of control he possessed. If a wife contradicted her husband before others, the embarrassment was immediate. The poorer the household, the less room there was for mistakes to be softened by space and abundance. One detail that often surprises people is how closely food and morality were linked. Eating too much, eating too eagerly, craving delicacies, or showing fussiness could all be criticised as failures of character. Religious writers warned against gluttony. Courtesy manuals warned against greed. Parents warned children not to be dainty, not to be demanding, not to reject what was placed before them. A child who said, in modern language, "I do not like that," might receive a look sharp enough to end the conversation. Preference existed, of course. People have always liked some foods and disliked others, but preference did not have the same public rights it often has now. The proper response to food was gratitude and restraint. This did not mean everyone behaved gratefully. Diaries, letters, and court records from the period show plenty of quarrels, drunken meals, insults, waste, indulgence, and complaint. But the ideal mattered because people measured each other against it. A person could fail privately. The danger was failing visibly. Alcohol also belonged to the table in ways that feel unfamiliar now. Beer, cider, ale, wine among the wealthier, rum punch in some colonial settings, and other fermented drinks were common parts of daily life. Water could be unsafe, and fermented beverages were normal. But drinking had rules too. A man who held his liquor could be sociable. A man who lost control could become a disgrace. Toasting carried etiquette. Refusing a drink in some company might be noticed. Drinking too much might be remembered. In taverns, political clubs, military gatherings and elite dinners, drink helped create bonds among men, but it also created risk. At the family table, cider or small beer might be ordinary, even for younger members in diluted form, yet drunkenness in the household could damage authority. A father who preached discipline and then slurred through supper gave the table a contradiction everyone could see, and no one might be allowed to name. The table also trained people in gender. Boys watched men carve, speak, bless, decide, and occupy the place of command. Girls watched women serve, manage, smooth tensions, notice needs, and perform restraint under labour. This does not mean girls learned only silence or boys only authority. Real life was more complex. Many girls learned arithmetic through household accounts, medicine through kitchen practice, negotiation through markets, and authority through managing younger children and servants. Many boys learned obedience through apprenticeship and dependence. Still, the table rehearsed a public idea of gender order. Men were to govern, women were to maintain. Men were to represent the household outwardly. Women were to make the household function inwardly. At meals, these ideas became visible in who led prayer, who served, who corrected, who ate while still watching everyone else, and who rose first to begin the next task. That last point matters. The meal did not end at the same time for everyone. A man might push back, stretch, reach for a pipe, talk business, or settle near the fire. Older boys might be sent to finish chores. Younger children might be moved toward bed or kept busy. Servants might clear. The woman of the house often continued working immediately. Scraps had to be saved. Dishes had to be cleaned with limited water. Wooden ware had to be wiped and dried properly so it would not sour. Pewter needed care. Knives had to be cleaned. Leftovers had to be guarded from animals, insects and spoilage. The fire had to be adjusted. The next morning's food might already need preparation. In that sense, even the table's hierarchy continued after the eating stopped. Some people rested from the meal, others recovered the room from it, and still it would be too simple to describe every 18th century table as grim. People found warmth there. They told news. They laughed when strictness loosened. They shared seasonal pleasures, fresh apples, new bread, a rare roast, a holiday pudding, a cup of tea with enough sugar to feel luxurious, a neighbour's story, a child's small triumph permitted into conversation at the right moment. A household table could be harsh, but it could also be intimate. It could remind every person of their place, but it could also remind them that they belong somewhere. That is the complicated truth. The same structure that limited people also held them. A child standing behind adults might feel ignored, but might also feel the security of knowing the rules. A wife serving others might feel exhaustion, but also pride in competence. A servant seated low might feel dependence, but also inclusion compared with being shut out entirely. Human beings make meaning inside the systems they inherit, even when those systems are unfair. Imagine now that the supper is moving toward its end. The father has had his portion. The mother has eaten between tasks, not always sitting as long as anyone else. The older children have behaved well enough, though one of them has been warned with a glance. The youngest has dropped something and been corrected. A servant has taken away a dish. The guest, if there is one, has been treated carefully. The salt sits where it sat before, harmless looking and full of old meaning. The firelight moves over bowls, hands, sleeves, faces. Nothing dramatic has happened. No one has fought. No one has declared a principle. No one has named the structure aloud. But the structure has been there the whole time. It has passed through the room in the order of seating, the timing of speech, the distribution of food, the blessing, the waiting, the watching, the silence of children, the movement of women, the lowered eyes of dependence, and the small privileges of those served first. This is why the table mattered so much. It made the invisible visible. It showed the household to itself. Every meal repeated the question, "Who are you in relation to everyone else here?" and every seat gave an answer. The strange thing is that the table still does this, though we often pretend it does not. Even now, meals reveal who cooks, who cleans, who interrupts, who gets listened to, who manages the children, who eats first, who rises last, who notices when the bread's gone, who refills the glasses, who is treated as a guest in their own home, and who is treated as the person responsible for everyone's comfort. We no longer place people above or below the salt in the old formal way, but we still have maps. They are just quieter. The 1700s were more honest about the map, or perhaps less embarrassed by it. As the table is cleared and the room shifts away from eating, another set of rules begins to take over. People have been seated, served, watched, and ranked. Now they must speak, and speech in the 1700s is its own dangerous territory. A careless word can travel farther than the person who spoke it. A joke can become an insult. A contradiction can become disrespect. A compliment can become flirtation. A truth can become trouble if it is spoken to the wrong person in the wrong tone at the wrong time. The meal has shown everyone where they belong, but the conversation after it will test whether they remember. The room is quieter now, not because the people inside it have nothing to say, but because saying something in the 1700s was rarely as simple as letting a thought leave your mouth. The meal has shown everyone where they belong. The father has occupied his place, the mother has watched the room while working through it. The children have learned again that hunger does not give them permission to interrupt, and any servant or apprentice near the table has felt the difference between being present and being equal. Now the bowls are being moved, the fire has settled lower, the room has entered that hour when people might talk, and that is where another set of rules begins. In the 1700s, conversation was not treated as a casual spill of opinions. It was a social skill, a moral test, a class signal, and sometimes a legal danger. A person could damage himself by speaking too soon, too loudly, too honestly, too warmly, too sharply, or to the wrong person in the wrong tone. That is one of the strangest things to sit with from our side of history. We often think of speech as self-expression. They often thought of speech as conduct. Words were not only words, they were behaviour, and behaviour could raise or lower a person in the eyes of everyone listening. Imagine that same household after supper. A neighbour has come by with news. He's taken a seat near the fire because he is known to the family, though not so close that he can forget courtesy. The father asks about the road, the price of grain, the health of someone's wife, the arrival of a letter, the rumour of a ship, or the doings of the local magistrate. The older children are still nearby, pretending not to listen and listening to everything. The mother is mending or clearing, but she hears every word. An apprentice stands near the wall waiting for instruction. In a modern room, the conversation might open in several directions at once, with people correcting each other, interrupting, laughing over the top, adding a thought before it disappears. In that 18th century room, every person is measuring the air. Who has the right to speak first? Who is being addressed? Is the subject safe? Is the person speaking above his station? Is the joke too familiar? Is the criticism too bold? Should the children be sent away? Should the servant be allowed to hear this? These questions may not be spoken, but they shape the room as firmly as the table did. The first rule of speaking was that not everyone had the same right to begin. Rank gave a person verbal space. Age gave a person verbal space. Gender, wealth, education, office, and household authority all affected who could speak freely and who had to wait. A child did not simply enter adult conversation because a thought occurred to him. A servant did not correct a master in front of company. A wife, depending on the household and the company present, might speak with intelligence and ease, or might be expected to let her husband carry the public voice of the family. An apprentice might have opinions about politics, wages, tools, trade, or weather, but opinions were not the same as permission. You could know something and still not be entitled to say it. This is a hard thing for modern people to imagine because we tend to treat knowledge as a kind of right. If you know the answer, you give it. If someone is wrong, you correct them. In the 1700s, correcting the wrong person could be worse than letting an error stand. Truth did not erase hierarchy. There were whole manuals teaching young people how to manage themselves in company. They warned against speaking too much, boasting, interrupting, whispering, laughing loudly, contradicting superiors, asking personal questions, and speaking of private matters in public rooms. These books were not written because everyone was naturally graceful. They were written because people kept failing. The rules had to be repeated because the temptation to talk badly, brag, gossip, flatter, blurt and argue was as strong then as it is now. Young George Washington copied rules of civility as a boy, and many of them concerned speech or the behaviour around speech. Do not speak when you should be silent. Do not show pleasure when another is embarrassed. Do not be quick to believe bad reports. Do not interrupt. Do not speak evil of absent people without good cause. Whether Washington followed these perfectly is not the point. No one does. The point is that a young person of ambition was expected to train the mouth the way a soldier trained the hand. Tone mattered. You could say the correct words and still be rude if the tone was wrong. A greeting delivered too casually could sound insolent. A reply too quick could sound defiant. A joke too sharp could become an insult. Even the volume of the voice carried meaning. Speaking loudly in polite company suggested poor breeding, unless the setting required it. Muttering could suggest secrecy or disrespect. Whispering in front of others was often considered rude because it created a private corner inside a shared room. A person who whispered at table might as well be telling everyone else that they were excluded. Staring while someone spoke could be impertinent. Looking away too much could seem inattentive. Laughter had to fit the company. Too little laughter could make you seem cold, proud, or dull. Too much laughter could make you seem foolish. There was an art to appearing pleased without appearing silly, attentive without appearing hungry for favour, modest without appearing stupid, and confident without appearing proud. Conversation was a balancing act performed in real time with no chance to edit afterward. Forms of address were one of the clearest verbal rules. Today, in many places, people move quickly to first names. A boss may introduce herself by her first name. A doctor might say, "Call me Anna." A teacher may tolerate casual speech from students. In the 1700s, names and titles carried sharper lines. Sir, Madam, Mistress, Master, Goodwife, Reverend, Captain, Doctor, Squire, Your Honour my Lord, Your Ladyship, Father, Mother, and countless local variations all located people in the social order. To use the wrong form could be insulting or embarrassing. Calling someone by a first name without permission suggested intimacy, superiority, or contempt. A servant used different language for a master than a friend used for another friend. A child did not address elders as if they were playmates. A young man courting a woman used careful forms until the relationship allowed more warmth. A customer in a shop might expect courtesy from the shopkeeper, but the shopkeeper also had to protect his own respectability by not sounding servile beyond what trade required. Every greeting was a tiny negotiation. The word sir, for example, could show respect, but even respect could be complicated. Said properly, it honoured. Said too heavily, it might mock. Said by one gentleman to another in a tense exchange, it could become stiff, almost dangerous. People in honour cultures often heard insult where modern ears might hear only firmness. Among gentlemen, speech could lead toward formal quarrels. A man accused of lying, cowardice, dishonour, or cheating might feel compelled to demand satisfaction. Duelling was not accepted everywhere in the same way, and religious authorities often condemned it. But in parts of 18th century elite culture, The fear of being thought a coward could push men into violence over words. The strange thing is that the words themselves could be small. A slight, a public contradiction, a refusal to apologise, a written insult, a rumour repeated in the wrong room. Honour was fragile because it lived in other people's opinions, and speech was one of the quickest ways to wound it. For ordinary people, words could lead to trouble through different routes. Slander was serious because reputation was serious. Accusing someone of theft, sexual misconduct, dishonesty, witchcraft in earlier contexts, religious hypocrisy or disease could injure livelihood and marriage prospects. Church courts, local courts, and community discipline often dealt with spoken offences. People sued over words, they complained over words, they fought in lanes, markets, taverns and churchyards over words. The law recognised that speech could do material harm. If a woman was called unchaste in a community where marriage and respectability shaped her future, that insult was not mere sound. It could change how people treated her. If a tradesman was called a cheat, customers might disappear. If a midwife was accused of incompetence, families might stop calling her. If a servant was said to be dishonest, she might lose the next place she needed to survive. In a world where reputation travelled by mouth, the mouth was powerful. There was also the offence of being a scold, especially for women in English and colonial traditions. A common scold was a person, usually a woman in the way authorities described it, accused of disturbing the peace through quarrelsome speech. The very existence of this category tells us something blunt about the period. Women's speech was policed not only when it was false, but when it was considered disorderly. A sharp-tongued woman could become a public problem in the eyes of neighbours and officials. Punishments varied by place and time, and some of the most theatrical punishments were not common everywhere, but the idea mattered even when the punishment was only social. A woman who spoke too loudly, argued too publicly, or mocked authority could be labelled troublesome. Men could be quarrelsome too, of course, and men filled taverns and courts with insults, threats, and drunken disputes. But women's voices were often judged against a stricter expectation of modesty. A man might be rough, a woman might be unruly. The difference in wording reveals the difference in judgment. Religious speech carried its own dangers. In many communities, careless words about God, scripture, ministers, church authority or doctrine could bring real consequences. Blasphemy, profanity, Sabbath-breaking talk, and public mockery of religion were not treated as private opinions in the way many modern societies might treat them. A person's speech could be understood as a threat to communal moral order. Ministers used sermons to correct speech. Parents corrected children for oaths and irreverence. Courts sometimes punished blasphemous or profane language. Even casual swearing could mark a person as disorderly or low. This does not mean people in the 1700s were all pious and careful. They swore, they cursed, they told dirty jokes, they mocked neighbours. Taverns rang with a language no courtesy book would approve. But the line between private roughness and public disgrace mattered. A man might curse in a field with other labourers and suffer no more than laughter. Curse in front of a minister, a magistrate, or respectable women, and the same words might become a problem. Politics made speech even more dangerous. The 1700s were full of political tension, imperial wars, taxes, revolutions, rebellions, newspaper battles, pamphlets, royal authority, colonial resistance, local faction, and suspicion. In a coffee house, tavern, print shop, or market, political talk could be lively, but not always safe. In Britain and its empire, seditious libel could punish criticism of government, even if the words were true, because the issue was not only factual accuracy, but whether the words encouraged contempt for authority. That is difficult for modern people raised on ideas of free political speech to absorb. We often think truth should protect the speaker. In much of the 18th century legal world, truth could still be dangerous if it undermined those in power. Printers, pamphleteers, and outspoken men took risks when they criticised governors, ministers, kings, assemblies, or military officers. In the American colonies, the famous trial of John Peter Zenger in the 1730s became important because it raised questions about truth and criticism in political printing. But the fact that the case mattered at all shows how charged speech could be. Words in print were speech with legs. They travelled farther than the speaker, and authorities knew it. Taverns were places where speech loosened. A man who would be careful at a dinner table might become bold after cider, ale, punch, or rum. Taverns carried news, arguments, jokes, songs, insults, business deals, rumours, and political opinions. They were necessary public spaces, especially for men, and they could be dangerous because they mixed classes and tempers in close quarters. A farmer might hear a traveller's news. A sailor might bring stories from another port. A tradesman might complain of taxes. A labourer might mock a local official. Someone might repeat the words the next day, polished or worsened in the telling. The tavern allowed speech to expand, but it did not erase consequences. Many a quarrel began with words spoken too freely in drink. Many a reputation for being loud, radical, irreligious, or unreliable began at a tavern table where a man forgot who was listening. Coffee houses, especially in cities like London, had their own speech rules. They were famous for news, newspapers, pamphlets, business, political debate, and talk among men who wanted to know what was happening beyond their own street. But even there, where conversation was part of the attraction, speech had customs. You did not necessarily speak as you would in a private parlour. You had to manage wit, argument, and credibility. A man who brought good information could gain standing. A man who repeated nonsense could become laughable. A man who argued too aggressively could be disliked. The coffee house was freer than the household table in some ways, but it had its own tests. Public speech rewarded those who could sound informed without sounding foolish, bold without sounding reckless, amusing without sounding vulgar. That is not so different from some modern public spaces, though the wigs and newspapers have changed. For women, the acceptable settings for speech differed by class, region, and circumstance. Women talked constantly, of course. They exchanged news at wells, markets, kitchens, church doors, spinning gatherings, childbirth rooms, and family visits. The idea that women were silent in the past is false. Women's speech held communities together. They carried medical knowledge, courtship news, warnings about men, household advice, birth stories, recipes, moral judgments, market information, and family memory. But women's public speech was often more constrained in formal mixed company. A woman could be praised for modest conversation, good sense, gentleness, wit kept within bounds, and the ability to listen. She could be criticised for loudness, contradiction, sexual boldness, gossip, vanity, or political sharpness, though plenty of women possessed all the intelligence required for politics, and found ways to express it through letters, salons, households, patronage, and influence over male relatives. The rule was not that women had nothing to say. The rule was that many societies tried to control how, where, and before whom they said it. The salon, especially in France and other parts of Europe, gives us another side of this world. In elite circles, some women became powerful organisers of conversation. A salon hostess could shape intellectual life by deciding who met whom, who was invited, who was encouraged, what tone prevailed, and which writers or philosophers gained attention. But salon conversation was not casual chatter. It required polish. Wit had to be sharp, but not crude. Disagreement had to entertain as well as persuade. A person who bored the room committed a social failure. A person who became too heated disturbed the balance. The hostess managed the talk almost like a conductor. This was speech as performance, and the stakes could be influence, patronage, reputation, and access to the people who mattered. The ordinary farmer's kitchen and the Parisian salon seem worlds apart, and in wealth they were, but both shared the idea that speech revealed training. The setting changed. The pressure remained. Letters were another form of speaking, and in some ways even more dangerous because they could be kept. A spoken mistake might fade or be denied. A letter sat in a drawer waiting to betray someone. Courtship letters especially had to be careful. Too much warmth too soon could compromise a woman. Too little warmth could discourage a suitor. A man might declare feeling, but he had to balance passion with respectability. A woman might respond, but she had to protect modesty even if she felt strongly. Families sometimes read letters. Friends carried them. Servants delivered them. A private message was not always private. In breach of promise cases, inheritance disputes, scandals, and family quarrels, letters could become evidence. People knew this. They wrote with feeling, but they also wrote with an awareness that the page might outlive the moment. One of the hardest rules of speech involved silence itself. Silence could be obedience, wisdom, fear, resentment, modesty, guilt, or strategy. A servant silent under correction might be considered proper. A wife silent in company might be praised as modest, or pitied if others sensed constraint. A child silent at table was well trained. A gentleman silent under insult might be judged cowardly if the insult was public enough. A neighbour silent when gossip was spreading might be considered discreet, or suspiciously unwilling to defend someone. Silence was not empty. It had meanings, and people read them. Knowing when not to speak was as important as knowing what to say. This is why the art of conversation in the 1700s was not only about eloquence, it was about timing. A good speaker knew when the room was ready. A safe speaker knew when the room was not. There is a moment that would have happened thousands of times in houses, shops, taverns and streets across the 1700s. Someone says something wrong. Not dramatically wrong. Not enough to stop the world, just wrong enough to change the air. A boy corrects his father in front of a guest. A servant laughs at a joke meant for the family. A young woman answers a compliment too quickly. A man makes a political remark before knowing the loyalties of the person beside him. A neighbour repeats a rumour with one detail too many. The room tightens. Someone looks down. Someone coughs. Someone changes the subject. The speaker realises, perhaps a second too late, that the words have landed badly. That feeling is not foreign to us. We still know it. The difference is that in the 1700s, the path from awkwardness to consequence could be shorter because reputation was closer to daily survival. Think of the shopkeeper. His speech has to be pleasant but not servile, persuasive but not dishonest, respectful to the wealthy, patient with the difficult, firm with debtors, careful with gossip, and never so blunt that customers feel insulted. He may know that a gentleman is slow to pay, but he cannot say it too openly without risking the man's anger. He may know that a housewife is buying on credit beyond what her husband approves, but he must manage the transaction without exposing her. He may hear political opinions at the counter and have to decide whether to agree, smile, deflect, or pretend not to hear. His livelihood depends not only on goods, but on talk. A bad mouth can ruin a good shop. Think of the servant. A servant hears everything. Arguments through doors, private complaints, courtship hints, debts, pregnancies, illnesses, family secrets, bad moods, hidden purchases, letters arriving, guests overstaying, masters lying politely to visitors. But hearing is not the same as being allowed to speak. A good servant was expected to be discreet. Too much talk could be fatal to employment. Yet servants also had their own networks. They carried information between households, sometimes accurately, sometimes not. Mistresses complained about servants gossiping because servants knew the truth behind polished tables. This created a strange tension. The people with the least formal power often held dangerous knowledge. Their speech was restricted but not powerless. Think of the young woman at a visit. She sits with other women, perhaps with men present. perhaps with her mother nearby. She's expected to be agreeable, not silent like a statue, not loud like a street vendor, not learned in a way that embarrasses the men, not foolish in a way that embarrasses her family. She must answer when spoken to, show modesty, avoid bold jokes, not seem eager for any particular man's attention, not appear cold if politeness requires warmth, not discuss improper subjects, not laugh too freely, not look bored, not show anger. If she's clever, she has to decide how much cleverness the room will tolerate. This is a real calculation. Too little wit, and she is dull. Too much, and she is forward. A young man in the same room has more room to perform, but he too is judged. Does he flatter excessively? Does he speak of money? Does he boast of horses, books, travel, or family connections? Does he listen? Does he speak respectfully to older women? Does he treat servants with unnecessary cruelty? Courtship is not only romance here, it is an audition of speech. Think of the child. A child learns that words move upward only by permission. Father speaks to you, you answer. Mother asks, you respond. A visitor notices you, you reply modestly. You do not volunteer adult opinions. You do not repeat household matters outside the house. You do not tell a neighbour what your parents said by the fire last night. Children were often warned against tale-bearing, lying, sass and idle words. Their tongues were trained along with their hands. In a world of large families and crowded rooms, a child who talked constantly could be treated as undisciplined. It was not that parents never enjoyed children's voices. Many did. But the public ideal was controlled childhood. A noisy child revealed a weak household. Now it would be wrong to imagine everyone living in constant fear of speech. People in the 1700s were not machines of restraint. They told stories, they teased, they sang, they recited verses, they read aloud, they argued theology, politics, crops, prices, marriages, weather, war and neighbours. They whispered in bed, laughed in kitchens, shouted across fields, bargained in markets, scolded animals, comforted children, prayed over the sick, and cursed when tools broke. Human speech was as full then as it is now. The difference is that the accepted boundaries were different, and the penalties for crossing them could be sharper, because so much of life depended on communal judgment. The art was not never speaking. The art was speaking in a way that fit the listener, place, rank, subject, and moment. There is something almost tiring about that, but there is also something worth noticing. Many people in the 1700s understood that words had weight. They knew that speech could bind, injure, elevate, expose, comfort, and destroy. A promise spoken before witnesses mattered. A vow at marriage mattered. A prayer mattered. A public apology mattered. A false accusation mattered. A blessing mattered. A curse mattered. We have more freedom now in many ways, and that freedom is precious, but it can make words feel cheap. We send them quickly, delete them, replace them, bury them under more words. In an 18th century village or household, words lingered because listeners carried them. A phrase spoken by the hearth could walk to the well in the morning, reach the church door by Sunday, and become common knowledge before the next market day. So the people in that room after supper are careful. Not perfectly careful, but trained in caution. The father asks the neighbour what he has heard, but not in front of the youngest children if the news is troubling. The mother says something about a family down the road, and stops before the remark becomes too sharp. The neighbour lowers his voice when he mentions debt. The apprentice pretends not to hear a name that might matter later. The oldest daughter keeps her eyes on her sewing when a young man is mentioned. A boy almost laughs and catches himself. A servant moves near the door and hears just enough to know more than she should. Every mouth in the room carries a little danger. Every silence does too. Outside the house, the same rules wait in different forms. At church, a whisper can offend. In the market, a rumour can grow legs. In the tavern, a toast can become politics. In a parlour, a compliment can become courtship. At a public meeting, a challenge can become faction. In a letter, a careless line can survive for decades. The 1700s did not invent social caution, but it made an art of it, because speech was tied so tightly to order. To speak well was to know your world. To speak badly was to reveal that you did not understand it, or worse, that you understood it and refused to obey. And now, as conversation moves beyond the table and toward the doorway, toward the street, toward visits and churchyards and assemblies and market mornings, the body has to join the mouth again. Words may be dangerous, but gestures can speak before words arrive. A bow too shallow, a curtsy too careless, a hat left on too long, a failure to step aside, a handshake offered when deference was expected, these could all say something a person never meant to say. The people of the 1700s did not only speak with voices, they spoke with knees, hats, hands, backs, eyes, and the space they gave or refused to give to other people. The next time someone enters the room, no one will need to ask who understands respect. The answer will be visible before anyone says a word. The next time someone enters the room, the conversation pauses before anyone decides to pause it. That is how strongly the body speaks in the 1700s. A latch lifts, a door opens, cold air moves in from the yard or street, and before the visitor has said more than a greeting, the household has already begun sorting the moment. Is this person older or younger, richer or poorer, a neighbour, a minister, a landlord, a customer, a servant, a cousin, a magistrate, a stranger with business? Does he remove his hat quickly enough? Does she dip her body in the right kind of curtsy? Does the child stand without being told? Does the apprentice move back from the fire? Does the woman of the house rise, or does her rank allow her to remain seated? All of this can happen in a few seconds, and to modern eyes it may look like nothing more than old-fashioned politeness. To the people inside that room, it is not nothing. It is the public order of the world being checked, confirmed, and repaired if necessary. In the 1700s, respect had a geography. It lived in distance, height, direction, placement, and movement. A person could show respect by lowering the head, bending the knee, stepping aside, standing up, giving the right hand, removing the hat, waiting at a threshold, walking slightly behind, sitting lower, or letting someone else pass first. A person could also insult by doing any of these things badly, too slowly, too shallowly, or not at all. This is one of the hardest habits of the period for us to understand, because modern respect is often imagined as internal. We think, I respect you, or I do not respect you, and the outward signs can be casual. A nod, a handshake, a smile, maybe a polite tone. But in much of the 18th century Atlantic world, respect had to be visible. If it was not visible, it might as well not exist. A servant who respected a master privately, but failed to bow properly in front of guests had still failed. A young man who admired a minister but kept his hat on too long had still failed. A child who loved his grandmother but remained sprawled when she entered the room had still failed. The body had duties. It was not enough to feel correctly. You had to move correctly. Bowing is a good place to begin because the bow seems simple until you look closely at it. We have reduced it, in many modern settings, to a stage gesture, something actors do after a performance, or something associated with particular cultures outside the everyday Western world. In the 1700s, the bow was ordinary but not uniform. There were small bows, deep bows, courtly bows, friendly bows, awkward bows, mocking bows, and bows so graceful that people noticed them as part of a person's breeding. A gentleman did not simply drop his head like a tired horse. He managed the whole body. The feet were placed, the torso inclined, the hat might be removed with the hand, the eyes lowered or directed carefully, the timing adjusted according to rank. Dance masters taught this. Parents corrected it. Boys practiced it. A young man entering polite society needed to know not only how to dance, but how to cross a room without looking like he had been raised in a barn. That phrase, or some version of that judgment, existed because movement revealed upbringing. You could be wearing a fine coat and still betray yourself with clumsy respect. The depth of a bow mattered because rank mattered. A man might give a slight bow to an equal, a deeper one to a superior, and a much more elaborate bow in courtly settings. To bow too deeply to someone beneath you could look absurd or sarcastic. To bow too little to someone above you could look proud. That is the trap inside ceremonial behaviour. It demands measurement. The body has to know how much humility the situation requires. Too much and you seem false. Too little and you seem insolent. In elite circles, this could become almost a science of angles. At royal courts, especially in places like Versailles or St James's, the choreography of respect could be severe. People knew who was entitled to stand close, who could sit, who must remain standing, who could turn a back and who must retreat carefully, who could speak first, and how a person should approach someone of high rank. But the idea travelled downward. Ordinary people did not live like courtiers, but they still understood that bodies had to acknowledge status. Women's curtsies carried the same burden in a different form. A curtsy was not simply a charming dip from a costume drama. It was a gendered act of respect, taught from childhood and performed across countless situations. The knees bent, the body lowered, the head inclined, and the movement had to be appropriate to the person being greeted. A young girl curtsied to elders, to social superiors, to guests, to clergy, to patrons, to employers, and sometimes to relatives within the family hierarchy. A woman of high rank might give only the smallest acknowledgement to someone beneath her. A woman of lower rank might make a deeper curtsy to a lady. In formal settings, the curtsy could be dramatic, controlled, and slow. In ordinary life, it might be brief. But even a brief curtsy was not meaningless. It said, "I recognise the relationship between us. I know where I stand." That phrase, "where I stand," is exactly the point. Respect in the 1700s was spatial. You stood nearer or farther. You sat higher or lower. You walked before or behind. You entered first or waited. You approached directly or remained at a distance until summoned. The world was constantly arranging people. A doorway was not just a doorway. It was a place where rank became visible. Who passes first? Who holds the door? Who steps back? Who waits? In a modern setting, holding a door may simply be courtesy, often detached from rank. In the 1700s, it could show deference. A lower status person made way for a higher status person. A young person gave way to an elder. Men often offered passage to women according to polite codes, but that courtesy existed alongside a broader hierarchy in which women's legal and public authority was sharply limited. This is one of the strange contradictions of the age. A woman might be handed into a carriage, bowed to, addressed with formal courtesy, and still lack control over property, marriage choices, wages, or legal identity. Ceremony could honour a person in one sense while containing her in another. Hats were perhaps the most visible daily instrument of respect for men. The hat was not merely weather protection or fashion, it was part of the language of honour. Men removed hats indoors before superiors, in churches, and in moments of greeting depending on context. To touch the hat, lift it, sweep it off, hold it under the arm, or keep it on all carried meaning. A gentleman might remove his hat with flourish. A labourer might pull his cap or touch the brim. A servant might stand bareheaded before a master. These gestures were so common that they became almost automatic, and because they were automatic, refusing them could become powerful. The refusal to remove a hat was not always just rudeness. Among Quakers, for example, the refusal of hat honour was a religious statement. Quakers objected to excessive deference toward human rank, and their practice of keeping hats on before social superiors, along with using plain forms of speech like thee and thou, could offend those who expected visible submission. That tells us how serious the gesture was. If keeping a hat on could become a religious and social controversy, the hat was doing more than keeping rain off a head. Think about a young apprentice walking with his master through a town. They meet a gentleman known to the master, perhaps someone who owns land, holds local office, or brings business. The master bows with proper respect. The apprentice removes his hat more deeply and says little unless spoken to. He does not stand shoulder to shoulder as if all three are equal. He does not keep his hands in his pockets, if he has pockets in the modern sense of the word, and he does not look bored. He learns by watching where his master places his body. A little behind, not too far as though ashamed, not too close, as though presumptuous. These things sound small until you imagine doing them every day for years. Hierarchy becomes posture. Social order becomes the way your shoulders sit. Streets had their own etiquette. In a narrow lane, people had to pass each other physically, and who stepped into the mud mattered. Better paving, cleaner edges, and protected walking space were not distributed equally. A person of lower rank might be expected to make way. Men might step aside for women of their class or higher, though poor women carrying loads were not treated with the same delicacy as ladies in silk. A gentleman might protect a woman's dress from filth, while ignoring a maid whose apron was already marked by work. The language of respect was never simply about kindness. It was filtered through class. A rich woman's inconvenience could become a matter of courtesy. A poor woman's burden could become invisible. In cities, the geography of respect could become almost crowded with signals. Sedan chairs, carriages, market carts, apprentices, porters, servants, soldiers, clergy, merchants, and beggars move through the same streets. Who yielded to whom depended on rank, gender, urgency, and sometimes force. A carriage announced status before the passenger appeared. Livery announced the household of a servant. A uniform announced military position. A wig, sword, cane, or quality of shoes could tell people how much room to give. People read these signals quickly. They had to. The street was not neutral ground. It was a moving map of privilege. Church made the map even more formal. In many communities, pews were assigned, rented, owned, or informally understood according to rank. The best pews were not simply the ones with the clearest view. They were the ones that showed status. A wealthy family might sit in a prominent pew. Officials, elders, and important households had places that marked their standing. Poorer people sat elsewhere, sometimes in galleries, back rows, or less comfortable spaces. Servants and enslaved people, where present, were often separated or placed according to the racial and class rules of the community. Children might sit under watch. The church was supposed to gather souls before God, but it also gathered bodies according to earthly hierarchy. That tension is important. People heard sermons about humility while sitting in seats that displayed inequality. They prayed under a roof where everyone could see who mattered locally. The spiritual message and the social arrangement did not always point in the same direction, but the people of the period often saw no contradiction. They believed order itself was part of divine design. The act of standing in church had rules too. When to stand, when to sit, when to kneel, when to remove the hat, when to bow the head, how loudly to respond, whether to sing, whether to remain silent. All of this varied by denomination and region, but it mattered deeply. A person who behaved incorrectly in worship could be judged as ignorant, disrespectful, dissenting, or impious. Religious gestures were not private preferences, they were public signals. In some places, refusal to conform to certain gestures could mark a person as outside the established order. The body at worship was watched as closely as the tongue at table. Courthouses and public meetings carried another kind of bodily respect. When a magistrate entered, people stood. When a judge spoke, people did not lounge. Hats came off, voices lowered. The architecture of authority placed some people above others literally. Benches, raised seats, rails, boxes, pulpits, platforms. Height mattered. A judge seated above the room did not need to explain authority every moment. The room explained it for him. A minister in a pulpit, elevated above the congregation, spoke from a position that turned theology into geography. A schoolmaster at the front of a room, a father at the head of the table, a landlord in the best chair, a ship captain on deck, all of these figures occupied space in a way that taught obedience. The 1700s loved visible order because visible order reduced the need for constant argument. At least, that was the hope. There were rules for walking with another person. To walk on someone's right could be a place of honour in many customs. To offer an arm could signal protection, intimacy, or propriety, depending on who offered it and to whom. A man did not simply seize a lady's arm. A lady accepted or declined within the limits of politeness. A younger person walking with an elder adjusted pace. A servant carrying parcels did not stroll as if companionable, unless the relationship allowed it. A husband and wife in public represented the household. Their arrangement could reflect local custom and class. Even the pace of walking could be judged. Too hurried might look undignified unless necessity explained it. Too slow might look affected. A woman walking alone too far, too late, or in the wrong place could become vulnerable to gossip, not because walking itself was wrong, but because public movement was interpreted through reputation. Visiting etiquette turned houses into maps. A visitor did not always enter straight into intimacy. There might be a threshold, then a hall, then a parlour, then perhaps a more private room depending on rank and relationship. The best room of the house, if there was one, existed partly to receive people properly. Not everyone was brought into it. Some business was handled near the door. A tradesman might remain in a service area. A close neighbour might come into the kitchen. A formal guest might be placed in the parlour. A social superior might receive the best chair. The mistress of the house might control the room by deciding where someone sat and how long they were kept waiting. Waiting itself could be a sign. To be received immediately honoured you. To be made to wait reminded you that access was not yours to command. Calling on people required timing. You did not always visit whenever you pleased. In polite circles, visiting hours developed as a way of managing sociability. Cards might be left. Servants might announce callers. A person might be not at home, which did not always mean absent. It could be a polite refusal. This world gave people indirect ways to manage relationships because direct refusal could be rude. The body and the doorway worked together. You might be admitted, delayed, or turned away by a phrase that allowed everyone to pretend no offence had occurred. We sometimes think of modern life as indirect, full of unanswered messages and polite excuses, but the 1700s had its own well-developed methods of avoiding people while preserving form. The dance floor offers one of the clearest examples of respect organised through movement. In assemblies and formal gatherings, dancing was not only recreation, it was a public display of training, rank, gender, and self-command. A person who danced well showed discipline and breeding. A person who danced badly risked embarrassment. Partners were chosen according to rules, and refusal could offend if mishandled. The order of dances could reflect status. The way a gentleman bowed to a partner, offered a hand, led her through the figure, and returned her properly matted. The way a woman accepted, moved, curtsied, and managed her eyes mattered too. Dance allowed proximity between men and women under supervision. That was part of its usefulness and its danger. It made social contact visible, rule-bound, and interpretable. The steps contained the flirtation. The bow made desire look respectable. This is why dance masters were more than instructors of entertainment. They trained posture, grace, and controlled movement. For ambitious families, teaching children to dance could be part of social advancement. A young person who moved well in company seemed more refined. Good movement suggested good upbringing. Bad movement suggested rusticity, awkwardness, or lack of discipline. This did not mean country people lacked dignity. Many did not care for elite Polish, and some religious groups criticised dancing as vain or morally risky. But in polite society, the body was a credential. You carried it everywhere, and it presented your family before you had a chance to explain yourself. Bowing and curtsying also worked inside the family. Children made gestures of respect to parents and elders. A child might stand when an adult entered, bow or curtsy to visitors, and receive correction for failing to do so. This was not empty ceremony. It taught children that age and authority deserved visible submission. A son did not greet his father as an equal. A daughter did not treat a visiting neighbour with casual familiarity unless invited. The household trained these gestures because the wider world would punish the child who did not know them. A badly mannered child embarrassed the family. A well-mannered child advertised parental discipline. In that sense, every child was a walking report on the home. Servants experienced bodily respect in more demanding ways. They stood while others sat. They waited behind chairs. They moved quietly. They carried things without drawing attention. They lowered the body, eyes or voice according to custom. A good servant knew how to be present without occupying too much social space. That phrase sounds cruel, because it is. To serve well often meant learning to shrink in public while remaining efficient. The servant's body was useful, necessary, and controlled. In elite households, footmen and maids might be trained carefully in how to enter, withdraw, present dishes, carry messages and stand in attendance. Their posture reflected the household's quality. A clumsy servant made a family look poorly managed. A polished servant became part of the family's display of rank, even while remaining personally subordinate. Enslaved people in the 18th century Atlantic world were forced into even harsher bodily codes. On plantations and in urban slaveholding households, gestures of deference were often demanded under threat of violence. Bowing, stepping aside, lowering the eyes, removing hats, using honorifics, waiting to speak, and making space for white people were not merely etiquette. They were part of a coercive racial order. This must be said plainly because the language of manners can soften what was in fact domination. The same outward gestures that looked like courtesy in one setting could be enforced humiliation in another. A free apprentice bowing to a master and an enslaved man being required to lower his eyes before an owner are not the same moral situation, even if both belong to the geography of respect. The 1700s used bodies to display hierarchy, and some of those hierarchies were brutal. There were people who resisted these gestures. Some did so religiously, like Quakers rejecting hat honour and refusing flattering titles. Some did so politically, especially in revolutionary moments when old deference to aristocrats, governors, or imperial officials came under attack. Some did so through satire, mocking excessive bows and empty compliments. Some did so simply by being rude, stubborn, drunk, or tired. Resistance could be small. A man might keep his hat on a fraction too long. A servant might curtsy carelessly. A young person might sit before being asked. A crowd might refuse to make way for an unpopular official. These small acts could be noticed because the expected behaviour was so clear. When everyone knows the choreography, a missed step becomes a statement whether or not the person intended one. During the Age of Revolutions, bodily respect became political in new ways. In British North America, old habits of deference did not disappear overnight, but they were challenged by a republican language that valued independence and equality among white male citizens. Men who once bowed deeply to governors or aristocratic figures began to think differently about what respect should look like. Titles became suspect in some circles. Simpler forms of address gained moral force. In France, after 1789, gestures associated with aristocratic privilege came under pressure. The politics of the body changed because the politics of society changed. But change was uneven. People do not stop bowing simply because a pamphlet says all men are equal. Bodies remember old rules. Habits survive ideas. Even among equals, gestures mattered because they maintained peace. Two men of similar standing meeting in the street exchanged bows or hat gestures, not because one submitted to the other, but because mutual respect confirmed that neither intended insult. That matters. Courtesy was not only vertical, it also worked horizontally. It allowed equals to acknowledge one another without conflict. The danger came when the level of respect did not match the relationship. Too little from an inferior insulted a superior. Too much from an equal could seem mocking. Too little from an equal could imply contempt. Human beings are very good at detecting slight differences when those differences affect pride. The 1700s gave people many tools for noticing them. There is a small, everyday scene that captures this better than any formal rule. A young man walks into a room where several people are gathered. An older woman sits near the fire. A gentleman stands by the window. Two younger women are sewing. A servant is near the door. The young man removes his hat as he enters. He bows first toward the most important person present, but he must identify that person correctly. If the older woman is the hostess and of high standing, she must be acknowledged with proper respect. If the gentleman is his employer, he cannot be neglected. He cannot rush toward the young women, even if that is where his attention wants to go. He cannot speak too warmly to one of them. He cannot ignore the servant entirely if a minimal acknowledgement is customary, but he cannot treat the servant like equal company either. He has to cross the room, greet, bow, wait, sit if invited, and begin conversation without disturbing the invisible lines holding the room together. We may call this manners. It is closer to social navigation. The word geography helps because these rules were not just gestures in isolation. They organise space. The best chair, the high pew, the head of the table, the right hand, the front of the procession, the raised bench, the inner room, the clean side of the path, the place closest to the fire, the order of entering a carriage, the position in a dance, the distance from a superior, the doorway where one waited, the threshold one could not cross without invitation. All of these were locations of respect. A person's status could be measured by where the body was allowed to go and how others moved around it. Women's bodies were especially controlled by these spatial rules. A respectable woman's movement through public space had to be managed carefully. Too much boldness in posture, eye contact, gait, or proximity to men could be judged. A curtsy displayed modesty and training. Lowered eyes could signal propriety. Controlled movement protected reputation. But again, protection and restriction lived together. The rules that guarded a woman from crude approach also limited her freedom. The rules that honoured a lady's presence also made working women's bodies less worthy of protection. An elite woman might be escorted carefully through a crowd, while a washerwoman carrying linen was expected to manage as best she could. Respect followed rank as much as gender. Men's bodies were watched for different failures. A gentleman was supposed to be controlled, upright, graceful, and neither too hurried nor too slack. Slouching, stumbling, sprawling, and rough movements suggested poor discipline. Yet he also had to appear masculine, not overly delicate. Too much polish could be mocked as effeminate or foreign, depending on the culture and politics of the observer. A soldier carried himself differently from a clergyman differently from a merchant, a farmer differently from a courtier. The body signalled occupation as well as rank. Hard labour shaped shoulders, hands, and gait. Polite training shaped carriage. People read both. Modern people sometimes assume that because these gestures were formal, they were fake. That is too simple. A bow could be sincere. A curtsy could be affectionate. Standing for an elder could reflect real love. Removing a hat in church could express genuine reverence. Giving someone the best chair could be kindness. The problem is not that all gestures were false. The problem is that the same gesture could mean many things depending on power. A servant's bow might be survival. A child's bow might be training. A friend's bow might be warmth. A courtier's bow might be ambition. A Quaker's refusal to bow might be conscience. A revolutionary's refusal might be politics. A drunk man's refusal might be foolishness. The gesture alone does not tell the whole story, but the gesture opens the door. And now picture an evening visit drawing to a close. The guest rises. Others rise according to rank and relationship. The host may walk him to the door or not, depending on importance. Hats are taken up. A gentleman bows, a woman curtsies, a servant opens the door. Children, if present, make their small gestures of respect. Outside, the lane is darkening, and the guest steps away carrying not only whatever news was exchanged, but an impression of the household. Were they respectful? Was the daughter modest? Was the son awkward? Did the servant move properly? Did the wife receive him with enough warmth? Did the husband show dignity? Nothing dramatic has happened. No scandal has broken out. Yet the household has been inspected through movement, and the verdict may travel quietly. This is what makes the social world of the 1700s feel both distant and familiar. We no longer bow and curtsy through daily life in quite the same way, at least not in most modern Western settings. We do not usually measure respect by how deeply someone bends or who gets the clean side of the road. But we still read bodies. We notice who stands when someone enters, who looks at a phone during conversation, who takes up too much space, who gives way, who blocks a doorway, who makes eye contact, who avoids it, who sits while others work, who moves as if entitled, who moves as if apologizing for being there. We have changed the gestures, but not the human habit of reading them. The 1700s simply made the system more explicit, more formal, and much harder to escape. By the time the door closes and the visitor's footsteps fade, the household settles again, but the work of being seen does not end. A body has bowed, curtsied, stood, waited, crossed, withdrawn, yielded and entered according to rules older than anyone in the room. Tomorrow those same. Rules will continue in the street, the church, the shop, the field, the parlour, the schoolroom and the market. Yet the body is not the only thing being read. Cloth speaks too. A sleeve, a ribbon, a buckle, a cap, a waistcoat, a patch, a pair of shoes, a gown too fine for the wearer's station, or a hat shaped in the newest fashion can announce ambition before the wearer says a word. In the 1700s, clothing did not merely cover the body that had learned to bow. It explained the body to everyone watching, and sometimes it accused the wearer of wanting more than society thought they deserved. Cloth speaks before the mouth does. That is the first thing to understand when we step from the doorway into the wider world of the 1700s. Before a person bowed, before she curtsied, before he gave his name, before anyone learned whether the voice was gentle or rough, the clothing had already begun giving evidence. A coat could tell people what kind of work a man did, or what kind of work he wanted them to believe he did not do. A cap could tell whether a woman was married, respectable, employed, mourning, plain in religion, fashionable in ambition, or simply too poor to replace what had worn thin. Shoes could reveal wealth faster than words. Hands could be hidden in fine cuffs or exposed with cracked skin beneath a work sleeve. A servant's livery could announce the status of the family he served more loudly than his own name ever could. A widow's black clothing could make grief visible long after the first shock of death had passed. A young man's wig could make him look sober, foolish, fashionable, desperate or ridiculous depending on its shape, powder, and the town in which he wore it. To modernise, clothing often feels like choice. In the 1700s, clothing was still choice, but choice inside a cage of cost, rank, gender, law, trade, religion, labour, weather, and public judgment. You did not simply get dressed, you placed yourself where others could read you. And the reading began the moment you appeared in the lane, the shop, the churchyard, the parlour, or the pew. Imagine a market morning in the middle of the 18th century. People are gathering while the air still has a chill in it. Carts are moving in, baskets are being set down, animals are making themselves known, and voices are beginning to rise as buying and bargaining start. A farmer arrives in coarse wool, leather shoes worn at the edges, perhaps gaiters or stockings marked by mud. a broad hat shaped more by use than fashion, and a coat made for endurance rather than elegance. A tradesman stands near his goods in cleaner clothing, not aristocratic, not poor, but respectable enough to invite trust. A maid passes with a plain cap, an apron, and sleeves that show work. A clergyman is recognised at a distance by sober dress. A gentleman appears in a coat cut from finer cloth, perhaps with bright buttons, a waistcoat, clean linen at the neck and wrists, stockings pulled neatly, shoes buckled, hat carried or worn in the correct way. A woman of some standing steps carefully because the street is dirty, and the hem of a gown can betray a careless walk. Her cap, gown, apron, cloak, gloves, or shoes all tell the watching town something about money, modesty, taste, and household management. Nobody needs a printed label. The town is full of labels already, stitched into seams and tied under chins. The first rule of clothing in the 1700s was that fabric itself had status. Wool, linen, silk, cotton, calico, lace, velvet, brocade, homespun, imported cloth, worn cloth, dyed cloth, undyed cloth, all of these carried meaning. A fine silk gown did not say the same thing as a plain linsey-woolsey one. A crisp linen shirt did not say the same thing as a stained or patched one. Imported textiles could announce access to trade and money. Homespun could announce necessity, economy, or during political boycotts in the American colonies, even patriotic virtue. Cloth was expensive because cloth carried labour. Before industrial production lowered textile costs in the 19th century, every garment represented a long chain of work. Fibre had to be grown, raised, harvested, sheared, retted, cleaned, carded, spun, woven, dyed, cut, fitted, stitched, altered, mended, washed, dried, and preserved. Even when families bought cloth rather than making it from raw fibre, the price reflected the labour behind it. This is why people owned fewer garments than modern closets would lead us to expect. This is why clothing was repaired again and again. This is why garments appeared in wills and inventories. A good coat could be worth naming. A gown could be altered for a daughter. A shirt could become a child's garment, then a rag, then tinder. Cloth did not disappear casually. It was used down to its last usefulness. That one fact changes how we should imagine clothing rules. They were not only about vanity, they were about value. To stain a good garment was a loss. To tear a sleeve was a problem. To outgrow a piece of clothing required household planning. To buy fabric beyond one's means could be as reckless as buying a horse one could not feed. A person dressed above his means was not only stylish, he might be financially irresponsible, morally vain, or socially dangerous because he blurred the signs other people relied on. Older European societies had long histories of sumptuary laws, rules that tried to govern who could wear certain fabrics, colours, furs, ornaments, and styles according to rank. By the 1700s, many of those laws had weakened, changed, or were unevenly enforced depending on place, but the habit of judgment remained. Even where the law no longer stopped a merchant's wife from wearing silk, neighbours might. Even where an apprentice could buy a fine waistcoat second-hand, people might laugh at him for pretending. Fashion was not free simply because a statute was absent. Society itself kept account. Dress too low, and you might be pitied or dismissed. Dress too high, and you might be mocked. Dress incorrectly for your age, sex, station, religion, work, mourning status, or setting, and people might remember. The safest clothing told a story that others found believable. That is a quiet but powerful rule. Your appearance had to match what the community thought was true about you. If it did not, the community tried to correct the story. For women, clothing was especially burdened with moral meaning. A woman's dress did not merely show taste. It suggested modesty, discipline, sexual reputation, household order, and family ambition. A gown cut too boldly, a neckline considered too revealing, a fabric too rich for the household income, too much ribbon, too bright a colour in a sober community, a cap worn carelessly, hair arranged too fashionably for the setting, all of these could become material for talk. This does not mean women had no pleasure in dress. They absolutely did. Women loved colours, textures, ribbons, caps, kerchiefs, shoes, fans, gloves, and the pleasure of looking well. It would be unfair to turn every woman into a victim of fabric. Clothing could be artistry, pride, flirtation, family strategy, religious expression, and personal satisfaction. But pleasure had to be managed. A woman who appeared too eager to be admired could be judged vain. A woman who looked neglected could be judged slovenly. A wife's clothing reflected on her husband's prosperity and judgment. A daughter's clothing reflected on her mother's training and the family's hopes for marriage. A servant's clothing reflected on her employer, unless it seemed too fine, in which case it reflected badly on the servant herself. The line was always being watched. Caps are worth pausing over because they are one of the most ordinary pieces of clothing that modern viewers often misunderstand. Many women in the 1700s covered their hair with some form of cap, not because they lacked hair or personality, but because hair covering was tied to cleanliness, modesty, age, marital status, labour and respectability. A plain linen cap helped keep hair controlled during work and protected it from smoke and dust. In more fashionable settings, caps could be delicate, trimmed, shaped and expressive. A cap could be practical in the morning and ornamental in company. The absence of a cap in the wrong setting could seem informal, childish, or suggestive, depending on context. Loose hair carried meanings that respectable adult women usually avoided in public. Hair was not just hair. It belonged to the language of the body. The same is true for stays, the structured garment worn by women and girls to shape the torso. Modern people often imagine all stays as torture devices, but the reality is more varied. Stays provided support, posture, and the fashionable line of the body. Girls might begin wearing them young, partly to train posture. Working women wore practical versions. Elite women wore finer ones. They could be uncomfortable, especially when tightly fitted or worn through long days, but they were also considered normal, decent dress. A woman without proper stays in the wrong company might appear undressed, sloppy, or sexually improper. Clothing created the respectable body, and the respectable body was not assumed to exist naturally. It had to be laced, pinned, tied, covered, and arranged. Men's clothing had its own strict messages. A proper man of some standing wore a shirt, waistcoat, breeches, stockings, shoes, coat, and hat, with variations according to rank, occupation, weather, and fashion. Breeches ended at the knee, which meant stockings and shoes were highly visible. Think about that for a moment. A modern man may hide a great deal beneath trousers, but an 18th century man's lower leg was part of his public presentation. Well-shaped calves were admired in fashionable circles. Stockings had to be clean and properly fitted. Shoes with buckles could show refinement. Boots suggested riding, military use, or particular kinds of travel and work. A gentleman's linen mattered enormously. Clean linen at the collar and cuffs signalled cleanliness and status, in a world where bathing practices differed from ours and outer garments were not washed constantly. Linen absorbed sweat and could be laundered more often than coats. A man might own only a few outer garments, but cared deeply about visible linen. A dirty shirt could ruin an otherwise respectable appearance. Wigs and hair created another layer of identity. Not every man wore a grand powdered wig every day, despite what costume dramas sometimes suggest. Wigs varied by rank, profession, fashion, and affordability. Some men wore their own hair tied back, some wore modest wigs. Professionals might favour sober styles. Fashionable men might wear elaborate shapes. Powder could be used to lighten and scent hair or wigs, and it became associated with gentility, though it also attracted criticism as artificial and vain. A wig required maintenance. It had to be dressed, powdered, protected from weather, and kept from looking absurd. Poorer men might not afford one, or might wear old styles. A fashionable wig in the wrong place could make a man look pretentious. A plain head in a formal room could make him look rustic. During the later 18th century, changing politics and fashion began to alter what hair meant. Simpler, more natural styles gained moral and political force in some circles. But through much of the century, hair remained a public statement. The head told a story just as surely as the coat. Then came the macaroni, one of the most mocked figures of 18th century fashion. In Britain especially, young men who returned from the Grand Tour with exaggerated continental styles were sometimes called macaronis. They wore elaborate clothing, high wigs, bright colours, delicate accessories, and affected manners that critics saw as excessive, effeminate, foreign, and ridiculous. Satirical prints made them look almost unreal, all hair, lace, tiny hats, and impossible posture. The mockery tells us something important. Fashion was not only admired, it was policed through laughter. A man who pushed style too far could be treated as a joke. The problem was not simply that he dressed finely. Elite men dressed finely all the time. The problem was that the macaroni seemed to make fashion more important than manliness, Englishness, seriousness, or proper rank. He crossed a line people wanted kept intact. Laughter pulled him back. Fashion has always had this danger. To be slightly ahead can make you admired. To be too far ahead can make you absurd. For servants, clothing could erase individuality while displaying another household's wealth. Livery is one of the clearest examples. A male servant in livery wore clothing that marked him as belonging to a particular family or employer. The colours, buttons, braid and cut could reflect the master's status. A footman was not dressed to express himself. He was dressed to advertise the household. The servant's body became part of the family's public image. A fine livery told guests and neighbours that the master could afford not only servants, but servants dressed for display. Yet the servant inside the clothing remained subordinate. He might look splendid while having little personal freedom. That contradiction is central to service. The clothing elevated the appearance of the position while keeping the person firmly in place. Female servants' dress was usually plainer and more practical, but still regulated by expectation. A maid who dressed too fashionably could be accused of vanity, theft, sexual ambition, or forgetting her station. Employers worried about servants wearing cast-off clothing that made them look too much like their mistresses. Cast-offs were common. Clothing moved downward through society. A gown no longer fashionable for a lady might be altered for a maid. A gentleman's old coat might clothe someone of a lower rank. Second-hand markets made fashion travel. This created anxiety because clothing could blur class lines. If a servant wore her mistress's former gown, what exactly was the town seeing from a distance? The fabric had status even if the wearer did not. That is why clothing rules mattered so much. They protected the legibility of hierarchy. Mourning dress was another code people were expected to understand. When someone died, especially in families with the means to observe custom, clothing changed. Black or dark garments, mourning bands, veils, gloves, ribbons, and later stages of half-mourning could signal grief and the relationship to the dead. Mourning was not only personal sorrow, it was public duty. To leave off mourning too soon could seem cold or disrespectful. To mourn elaborately could show status and feeling, though it also cost money. Poor families might not afford full mourning clothing, but they still marked death as best they could. Widows in particular were visible through mourning. Their clothing announced loss, vulnerability, and a changed legal and social condition. A widow could sometimes have more legal and economic agency than a married woman, but she was also watched. Her return to colour, sociability, or courtship could become a subject of comment. Clothing measured grief in public time. It told the community how long sorrow was supposed to remain visible. Religious groups use clothing to reject vanity or mark discipline. Quakers are one of the best-known examples, with plain dress becoming a visible expression of spiritual values. Plainness did not mean carelessness. It meant resisting excess, luxury, and the pride associated with fashion. Simple colours, restrained cuts, and avoidance of unnecessary ornament could become a testimony. Other religious communities had their own expectations of modesty and sobriety. In these settings, clothing rules did not come only from class, they came from conscience. But plain dress also created its own identity. A plainly dressed person could be recognised as belonging to a community with particular beliefs. That recognition could bring respect from some, and suspicion or mockery from others. Even rejecting fashion became a way of being read. Political clothing also grew more important as the century moved toward revolution. In the American colonies, homespun cloth became a symbol during boycotts of British goods. Women gathering to spin could be praised as patriotic. A plain garment made from domestic cloth could carry political meaning because it rejected imported luxury and imperial taxation. This did not mean every homespun garment was political. Many were simply necessary. But in the right moment, necessity could become virtue. Clothing that once marked rural economy could be reframed as public principle. That is how flexible clothing signs could be. The same fabric might mean poverty in one year and patriotism in another. People understood this and used it. They dressed not only for weather and rank, but for argument. Colour and dye also mattered. Bright, stable dyes often cost more. Certain colours faded quickly, while others required more expensive materials or processes. A vivid garment could signal wealth or access. Dark, sober colours could suggest seriousness, age, piety, mourning, or professional identity. White linen suggested cleanliness, but demanded labour to maintain. A garment's colour told not only what someone liked, but what the household could afford to wash, replace, and protect. Keeping clothing clean in the 1700s was not a small matter. Streets were dirty, fires smoked, work stained, laundering took labour. Fine fabrics could not simply be tossed into a machine and forgotten. Rain, mud, grease, candle wax, ink, soot, and animal smells all threatened appearance. To appear clean required planning and work, often women's work or servants' work. A clean cuff was never just a clean cuff. It was evidence of labour hidden behind the wearer. Children's clothing trained them into the same world. A child in leading strings, a girl in stays, a boy in breeches after breeching, an apprentice in work dress, a young lady beginning to dress more like an adult. All of these changes marked stages of life. Breeching, when a small boy moved from gown-like garments into breeches, could be an important moment in his childhood, a visible step toward male identity. Girls learned modesty through pins, caps, stays, aprons, and careful management of skirts. Children were corrected for dirtying or tearing clothing not only because repair cost time, but because clothing represented family discipline. A child sent out poorly dressed could embarrass the household. A child overdressed could suggest parental vanity. Even childhood had a dress code tied to the family's reputation. Work clothing complicates our picture because not everyone lived in formal attire. Most people spent much of life in practical garments. Aprons protected gowns and waistcoats. Smocks, shifts, caps, kerchiefs, coarse stockings, patched breeches, leather aprons and heavy shoes belonged to labour. A blacksmith did not dress like a lawyer at the forge. A washerwoman did not dress like a merchant's wife while hauling wet linen. A sailor's clothes differed from a farmer's. Occupational clothing had dignity of its own, but it also fixed people in place. You could often see work on a person before knowing the name. Hands and clothing together formed a record. Burns, stains, calluses, patched knees, sun fading, and worn elbows all told the truth that fine manners sometimes tried to soften. At the same time, people changed clothes when circumstances required it. A person might have work clothing and Sunday clothing, ordinary wear and best wear. Sunday best mattered deeply. Church gathered the community, and people appeared there not only before God but before neighbours. Families wore their cleanest, most respectable garments if they could. A poor family might save one decent coat or gown for church and important visits. The act of dressing for worship became a public effort at dignity. It said, "We may work hard, we may not be rich, but we understand respect." In small communities, everyone knew which garments were old, which were new, which had been altered, which had been inherited, and which perhaps had been bought with money that should have gone elsewhere. The churchyard after service could be as observant as any court. Fashion magazines, prints, dolls, letters, shops, and travellers helped spread styles, though not evenly. A new sleeve shape might appear first among the wealthy, then be copied by middling women, then adapted by local seamstresses, then mocked by those who preferred older ways. A hat style might travel from court to city to provincial town and arrive slightly late, which could be its own embarrassment. Being too far behind fashion could make a person look rustic. Being too aggressively current could make a person look vain. The respectable middle tried to keep up without appearing desperate. This pressure is very familiar if you think about it. We still live with versions of it. The names of the garments have changed, but the anxiety remains. Dress too formally and people wonder what you're trying to prove. Dress too casually, and they wonder whether you understand the occasion. Wear a brand too loudly, and it says something. Wear something worn out, and it says something else. The 1700s did not invent clothing judgment. It simply made it more open and more tied to rank. There were also legal and institutional clothing rules for specific groups. Soldiers wore uniforms that announced regiment, rank, and allegiance. Sailors had practical clothing shaped by work, though naval uniforms became more formalised over the century. Clergy wore garments that signalled office and seriousness. University men, lawyers, judges and officials had robes, gowns, wigs or formal dress marking profession and authority. These clothes did not only identify, they transformed the wearer in public eyes. A judge in ordinary clothes is a man. A judge in robes, elevated in court, becomes law made visible. A soldier in uniform becomes part of an army. A clergyman in clerical dress becomes more than a neighbour. He becomes a religious office moving through the street. Clothing made institutions visible in daily life. It reminded people that authority had a costume. That costume could inspire respect, fear, resentment, or trust, depending on the viewer. One of the most interesting things about 18th century clothing is how often it created tension between reality and appearance. A poor gentleman might maintain a fine coat because status required it, while his finances collapse behind the scenes. A prosperous tradesman might dress modestly to avoid appearing vain or socially ambitious. A servant might wear cast-off silk and look finer than her wages allowed. A thief might dress respectably to gain trust. A prostitute might imitate polite fashion to attract clients while risking moral condemnation. A runaway apprentice or enslaved person might be described in newspaper advertisements by clothing because garments were key to identification. Those ads often listed coats, waistcoats, breeches, gowns, caps, shoes, scars, speech, and posture in detail. Clothing helped authorities and owners track people because clothing was memorable. The garment became evidence in the public search for a body. That is a darker side of the readable world. When everyone reads clothing, clothing can help control movement. It can expose people trying to escape the place assigned to them. In slave societies, clothing was frequently used to enforce racial hierarchy. Enslaved people might be issued coarse garments, limited in quality, quantity, or style, while laws and customs restricted access to certain forms of dress. Yet enslaved and free black people also use clothing creatively where possible, for dignity, resistance, identity, and self-presentation. A head wrap, a coat, a bright cloth, a carefully kept garment, or a Sunday outfit could carry meanings not fully controlled by enslavers. Clothing under oppression is never just oppression. It can also be a field of agency, however constrained. But the constraints were real and often violent. A society that insists on visible hierarchy will punish those who dress outside the line, especially when the line protects power. We should not let the beauty of 18th century fabrics hide the brutality of the systems around them. Still, in the ordinary home, much of clothing life came down to maintenance. After the market, after church, after visits, garments had to be brushed, aired, patched, folded, altered, let out, taken in, whitened, pressed and protected from moths. Pins were essential. Buttons could be costly. Ribbons were saved. Lace was removed and reused. Aprons took the first damage so gowns could survive. A woman might turn an old gown, recutting it so the less worn fabric showed. A man's coat might be remade for a son. Nothing was simply thrown away if it could be useful. Clothing rules therefore rested on constant labour. The clean, ranked, readable world depended on needles moving in poor light. It depended on women judging whether a cuff could last another month, whether a stocking could be darned again, whether a daughter's gown could be altered before a visit, whether the family could afford new shoes before winter. The public saw respectability. The household knew the arithmetic behind it. There is something revealing about a society that cares so much what people wear. It tells us that identity was not considered fully private. Your body entered the world as part of a household, a rank, a gender, a religion, a trade, a moral reputation, and sometimes a political position. Clothing made those connections visible. It could protect you by making you legible. A properly dressed widow was understood. A properly dressed servant was employable. A properly dressed gentleman received credit. A properly dressed young woman gained trust. But clothing could also trap you, because once the world had read you, it expected you to remain inside the sentence it had written. Dress too finely, and you were reaching. Dress too plainly, and you might be dismissed. Dress too brightly, and you were vain. Dress too loosely, and you were immodest. Dress too fashionably, and you were ridiculous. Dress too poorly, and people assumed failure. Every morning a person had to enter this argument with fabric. Now return to that market street as the day grows busier. The farmer's coat is still rough. The maid's apron is already marked by work. The gentleman's linen is still clean, though he is careful where he steps. The merchant's wife has noticed another woman's ribbon and is deciding whether it is tasteful or excessive. A young apprentice sees a waistcoat in a shop window and imagines himself transformed by it. A widow in black receives a softer greeting from one neighbour and a measuring look from another. A Quaker passes in plain dress, refusing the vanity others accept as normal. A servant in livery waits behind his master, splendid and subordinate. A child tugs at a sleeve and is told not to dirty it. Nobody says, "Let us now discuss rank." They do not need to. Rank is walking around in wool, linen, silk, leather, lace, and powder. The town is dressed as itself, and somewhere in that same town, perhaps near a church gate, perhaps in a parlour later in the week, perhaps at a dance where candles will make buckles flash and silk shift in the light, clothing will become part of an even more delicate performance. A young woman's gown will be noticed by a young man who must not stare too openly. A young man's coat will be judged by a mother who is thinking not only about charm, but income, discipline, and prospects. Gloves will touch. Eyes will lift and lower. A ribbon, a fan, a sleeve, a borrowed carriage, a carefully chosen cap, all of it will enter the quiet negotiations of courtship, where being seen is necessary and dangerous at the same time. In the 1700s, love did not simply walk into a room and announce itself. It had to be dressed properly, watched carefully, and kept from standing alone in the wrong place for too long. In the 1700s, love rarely began in private, at least not if a family had anything to say about it. That may be the first thing that feels strange from where we sit now. We're used to imagining romance as something that belongs to two people first, with everyone else arriving later, sometimes happily, sometimes with objections, sometimes after the couple has already decided what the story will be. A man and woman meet, talk, walk, write, choose, and only afterward does the family become involved. But in much of the 18th century world, especially among respectable families with property, trade, name or reputation to protect, courtship was never only about two hearts finding each other. It was about households. It was about land, labour, credit, inheritance, religion, fertility, class, reputation, and whether two families could stand being tied together in public for the rest of their lives. Affection mattered, sometimes deeply. People in the 1700s were not made of wood. They longed, flirted, blushed, hoped, made foolish decisions, wrote letters they probably should not have written, and suffered when someone they loved married another. But love had to move through a crowded room. It had to pass parents, neighbours, ministers, servants, siblings, employers, gossip, money, and the hard fact that a woman's reputation could be damaged faster than it could be repaired. That is why being seen alone could be frightening. Not because every conversation between a man and a woman was scandalous, and not because every family lived under the same strict rules, but because appearance had power. If enough people believed a meeting meant something, then it began to mean something whether the couple intended it or not. A lane at dusk, a garden path, a kitchen doorway, a ride in a carriage, a letter delivered privately, a conversation that lasted too long after church, these could all become evidence in the court of neighbourhood opinion. No judge needed to sit. No paper needed to be filed. A girl's name could simply start moving through mouths, and once a name was moving, it did not always return clean. Picture a young woman in a town around 1750. She's perhaps 16, 17, or 18, old enough that people have begun thinking of her marriage prospects whether she asked them to or not. She's dressed carefully, not extravagantly, because too much display can create one kind of talk, and too little care can create another. Her mother has noticed the fit of her gown. Her father has noticed the young men who speak to her after Sunday service. Her older brother has opinions he may not have been invited to express. Neighbours have already formed small judgments about her, whether she's modest, whether she laughs too freely, whether she works well, whether she seems vain, whether she will bring a useful dowry, whether she's strong enough for farm life, whether she has been indulged, whether she's pious, whether she's handsome, whether she knows how to hold her tongue. None of these judgments may be fair. Fairness is not the first rule of reputation. Visibility is. Now imagine that a young man begins to show interest. Perhaps he's a neighbour's son, or a journeyman in a trade, or a clerk, or a farmer with prospects, or a widower looking for a second wife to help manage children and household. He cannot simply appear at the door and carry her off into private feeling, at least not without causing trouble. His interest has to become legible to others. He may linger after church, but not too long. He may speak to her in company, but not too warmly at first. He may find reasons to visit the household, but the reasons must be respectable. He may bring news, assist with an errand, attend a gathering, dance with her if dancing is permitted and the setting allows it, or speak with her family in ways that make his presence normal. The early part of courtship is often a performance of not appearing too eager while making sure the right people notice exactly enough. That is a delicate art. Too little interest and the girl may assume nothing is intended. Too much interest and the whole neighbourhood may assume everything is intended before anyone has made a promise. A young man's reputation mattered too, though differently. He had to be assessed. Did he work steadily? Did he drink too much? Was he in debt? Did he come from a family that kept its word? Was he likely to inherit land or a business? Could he provide? Was he religious enough for the family standards? Was he rough? Was he proud? Was he too smooth? A charming man could be dangerous if charm was all he had. Parents understood this. A daughter's marriage could secure her future or ruin it. Under coverture in English and colonial legal traditions, a married woman's legal identity was largely absorbed into her husband's. that meant marriage was not a light choice. A wife's property, labour, sexuality, children, and public standing became bound to the man she married in ways that modern romance stories often avoid confronting. Love might warm the decision, but law hardened it. Families watched because the consequences were real. The chaperone, in this world, was not only a comic obstacle placed between lovers for drama. The chaperone was a social technology. She, or sometimes he, existed to make respectable contact possible. A mother, aunt, older sister, servant, cousin, neighbour or family friend could allow a young couple to be near one another without being alone in a way that invited suspicion. That is the part worth understanding. Chaperones did not simply stop courtship. They made courtship socially survivable. A young man and woman could speak in a parlour while others sat nearby. They could walk in a group. They could dance in public under many eyes. They could exchange remarks at a tea table, at church, at a fair, in a household gathering, or while working in a shared setting. Supervision protected the appearance of virtue, and appearance mattered because virtue was assumed to need witnesses. To modern people, this can feel suffocating. Imagine trying to learn another person's character while never quite being free of other ears. Imagine wanting to ask a serious question, perhaps about temper, fear, money, faith, children, or the future, while a mother sits with sewing 10 feet away and hears more than she pretends to hear. Yet this was the structure many people lived inside. Privacy was not considered the natural beginning of courtship. Privacy was something granted slowly, cautiously, and sometimes never fully before marriage. The parlour became one of the central stages of respectable courtship where parlours existed. Not every household had a separate parlour, of course. In modest homes, courtship might unfold in a kitchen, by the hearth, in a workroom, on a doorstep, or under the eyes of family members who were cooking, mending, spinning, or pretending not to listen. In wealthier or middling homes, a parlour allowed the family to present respectability. Chairs were arranged. Tea might be served. The mother could remain present without seeming to guard the daughter like a locked chest. The young man could demonstrate manners. He could show whether he spoke respectfully to elders, whether he knew when to stand, whether he stared too much, whether he could hold conversation without vulgarity, whether he treated the household servants as invisible tools or as human beings below him in rank, but still deserving measured courtesy. A courtship visit was an examination. The young woman was being watched, but so was he. Did he remove his hat properly? Did he compliment too boldly? Did he stay too late? Did he speak of money too early? Did he treat the father with proper seriousness? Did he make the girl laugh in a way that pleased or alarmed the room? Small things mattered because small things were believed to reveal the larger person. There is something almost funny about imagining romance under this level of inspection, but the humour fades when you realise how little room there was for a woman to recover from a damaged name. A man might be called reckless, and that could hurt him. A woman might be called forward, loose, imprudent, or compromised, and those words could narrow her life. Virginity before marriage was not merely private morality in many communities. It was tied to family honour, inheritance certainty, religious discipline, and marriageability. A pregnancy outside marriage could become a crisis involving church discipline, legal action, family negotiation, forced marriage, abandonment, or lifelong stigma. Women bore most of the shame, though men could also face legal or social pressure, especially if a child needed support. This imbalance shaped every rule around being alone. The fear was not only what might happen, it was what people might say had happened. A closed door was dangerous because imagination could enter it. Letters carried the same risk. A love letter looked sweet in a museum case, folded neatly, ink browned with time, the handwriting careful and slanted. But in its own moment, a courtship letter was not merely romantic. It was evidence. Letters could be shown to parents. intercepted by siblings, carried by servants, misdelivered, saved, used in legal disputes, or read after a relationship collapsed. A woman receiving letters privately from a man risked appearing more attached than propriety allowed. A man writing too passionately risked creating obligations he might later regret. Promises mattered. A breach of promise, where a marriage promise was made and then broken, could have legal consequences in some places, especially if a woman's prospects were harmed by relying on that promise. Words on paper could become a trap, yet people wrote them anyway, because longing always looks for a channel. They wrote carefully at first, with respect, restraint, references to family, health, weather, duty, and hope. They learned to say feeling without appearing uncontrolled. The language could seem formal to us, but formality did not mean absence of emotion. Sometimes it meant emotion had been dressed for public survival. Dancing created another supervised danger. In assembly rooms, country dances, balls and community gatherings, men and women could touch hands, move together, exchange glances, and speak briefly under the protection of music and pattern. The dance made proximity respectable by making it rule-bound. A young man could ask a young woman to dance. She could accept, or sometimes refuse. The refusal had to be managed carefully to avoid insulting him or exposing preference for another. Mothers watched, friends watched, rivals watched. Everyone noticed who danced with whom, how often, how warmly, and with what expression. A dance was not an engagement, but repeated attention could start people talking. If a man danced too many times with the same woman, he might be expected to mean something by it. If he did not mean it, he could be accused of trifling with her. If she seemed too pleased, she could be judged as eager. The entire room became a measuring device. That is what makes the 18th century dance floor so revealing. It allowed desire to appear, but only through choreography. The steps gave young people a way to approach each other while society kept count. Rural courtship could look different, but not necessarily freer. In farming communities, young people met through work, church, seasonal gatherings, harvests, husking bees, spinning gatherings, fairs, and visits between households. Work itself could create opportunities. A young man helping with a task might speak to a young woman while others were nearby. A group gathering could turn labour into sociability. In some parts of New England and other communities, practices such as bundling appeared, where a courting couple might be allowed to spend time together at night in bed or near bed, sometimes separated by clothing, boards or other barriers, under the assumption that warmth, supervision by proximity, and community norms would preserve chastity. This practice shocked many outsiders and moralists, and it was never as simple or universal as later stories made it seem. But its existence tells us something important. Courtship needed time. Houses were small, weather was cold, workdays were long. Young people needed a way to talk. Communities developed customs that balanced opportunity and control, sometimes in ways that look almost unbelievable now. The goal was not modern privacy. The goal was managed access. A couple had to know each other enough to marry, but not so freely that reputation collapsed before the wedding. In cities, courtship could be more varied and more risky. More people meant more anonymity, more temptation, more entertainment, more class mixing, more danger, and more opportunity to hide. A young woman employed as a servant might meet men through errands, markets, households, or the streets, but her freedom was constrained by her employer's rules and her vulnerability. A servant's pregnancy could cost her position and future security. Apprentices and journeymen often had restrictions around marriage because masters wanted labour undistracted and contracts fulfilled. A young man bound to a trade could not always marry when he wished. His body, time and future income were tied to his apprenticeship. Courtship among the labouring poor therefore had its own pressures. Marriage required resources, a place to live, tools, wages, bedding, clothing, cooking equipment, and the ability to survive the next winter. Love without a household plan was dangerous. The poor did marry, of course, and they courted with feeling, humour, urgency and resilience. But poverty narrowed choices. A marriage could be delayed for years while a couple saved enough to begin. A pregnancy could force a decision. A family might oppose a match not because they disliked romance, but because everyone could count the cost. Among elites, courtship was often even more entangled with property. A daughter's marriage could join estates, settle debts, strengthen political alliances, or repair family standing. A son's marriage could bring dowry, land, connections, and heirs. Parents might negotiate settlements with great care. Lawyers could become part of the love story before the wedding ever happened. This does not mean elite couples never loved one another. Many did, and letters from the period show affection, tenderness, teasing, longing, and grief. But love among the propertied had to coexist with contracts. A young woman might like a man her family considered unsuitable. A younger son might have charm but little inheritance. A widower might bring security but no romance. A match could be sensible and emotionally cold, or affectionate and economically foolish. The 1700s did not separate the heart from the ledger as cleanly as we sometimes pretend to do. Even today, we do not separate them completely. We only speak more softly about the ledger. Chaperones were expected to protect not just bodies, but negotiations. A family wanted time to evaluate. They did not want a daughter emotionally committed to someone before his intentions were clear. They did not want secret promises forming in shadows. They did not want seduction hidden under courtship. The word seduction carried heavy meaning in the 1700s. It could refer not simply to mutual desire, but to a man persuading, promising, flattering, pressuring, or deceiving a woman into sexual intimacy outside marriage. A woman's consent in the modern sense was not understood through the same legal and moral categories we use now, and many women had little protection from coercion by men of higher power. Servants could be vulnerable to masters, employers, lodgers, and men in the household. Enslaved women in colonial slave societies faced sexual exploitation under conditions where legal consent was impossible in any meaningful sense. This must be held separately from the polite world of chaperone parlours. The social rules that guarded some daughters did not guard all women equally. A planter's daughter might be watched fiercely to preserve her marriage prospects, while an enslaved woman in the same region could be denied any recognised right to refuse the men who controlled her life. The 1700s spoke constantly about female virtue, but it did not protect female vulnerability evenly. That contradiction is one of the cruelest truths beneath the polished surface of courtship. For free, respectable women, the chaperone's presence could be restrictive, but it could also offer protection from pressure. A young woman could refuse a private meeting by leaning on the rule that she should not be alone. She could avoid a man without openly accusing him. She could let her family slow a courtship she did not want. Etiquette sometimes gave women indirect power in a world that denied them direct authority. A mother could say no by never leaving the room. An aunt could interrupt a conversation before it turned serious. A sister could accompany a walk. A servant could be sent along with a message that was not really about the errand. These small acts shaped lives. They could protect a young woman from a bad match, or they could trap her away from a match she desired. The same tool cut both ways. There is a scene that would have been familiar in many forms. A young man calls at a house in the evening. He is welcomed, but not with complete ease. The mother sits near the fire with sewing. The father is present at first, then perhaps leaves after, judging that the visit is proper, though he may remain close enough to hear. Younger siblings drift in and out, annoying everyone and serving the useful purpose of making privacy impossible. The young woman pours tea, or works at a needle, or sits with her hands arranged more carefully than comfort requires. The young man speaks of neutral things: weather, roads, church, family health, local news, perhaps books if the household values reading, perhaps crops, trade, or a coming assembly. Under the surface, everyone knows the real subject is not whether. The real subject is whether he will come again, whether she wants him to, whether her parents approve, whether he has the means to marry, whether his manners are steady, whether his attention is honourable, whether the household can allow this to continue. Nothing improper happens. No hands touch except perhaps in the passing of a cup. No promise is made. Yet after he leaves, the house is full of meaning. The mother may ask a careful question. The father may say very little, which may mean approval or distrust. A sister may tease. A younger brother may repeat something embarrassing. The young woman may lie awake longer than usual, replaying 2 sentences and a glance that no one else noticed, or that everyone noticed and politely ignored. Being alone was dangerous, but being watched was not easy either. Watched courtship required performance. A woman had to appear modest but not indifferent. A man had to appear serious but not desperate. Families had to appear hospitable but not overeager. Everyone needed to maintain the fiction that the process was natural while carefully managing nearly every minute of it. Sometimes couples found ways around the rules. They met at gates, exchanged notes through friends, used siblings as messengers, lingered after church, arranged to be part of the same work gathering, or relied on servants who could be bribed with small favours or affection. History is full of rules and just as full of people slipping around them. But slipping carried risk. If a secret courtship was discovered, the secrecy itself became evidence. Why hide if nothing improper was intended? That question could do damage even when the answer was simple, because the family would have said no, because the couple wanted time, because affection had outrun permission, because young people are young in every century. Public spaces offered safer contact, though not freedom. Church was one of the most important meeting places. People dressed carefully, families gathered, young men saw young women saw who was looking, and the community watched itself watch. A glance across a churchyard could begin a story, a conversation after service could lengthen it. But church also imposed seriousness. Flirtation had to hide inside restraint. Too much laughter near the church door could offend. Too much attention during worship could be noticed. Ministers sometimes warned against vanity, lust and disorder among young people. Yet the church remained a marriage market, whether ministers liked that language or not. Where else would respectable young people see each other regularly under family supervision? Markets and fairs were livelier, more mixed, and more dangerous. There was noise, trade, food, drink, animals, strangers, and movement. A young woman could speak to more people there, but she could also be more easily watched or approached. A man might use a fair to show generosity, buying a small treat or ribbon, but gifts were tricky. A gift could be innocent or it could imply a claim. Accepting gifts from a man could suggest encouragement. Refusing one could embarrass him. In some communities, tokens of courtship mattered. Rings, ribbons, gloves, books, small objects or practical gifts. But gifts were never only things, they were signs. Who gave it? Who saw it? Was it accepted privately or publicly? Could it be returned if the courtship ended? A broken courtship was not simply sadness. It was a problem of objects, promises, reputation and explanation. The terror of being seen alone was strongest for women because their bodies were treated as carrying family honour. That phrase, family honour, sounds grand, but it could settle heavily on an ordinary girl carrying water or walking home from a neighbour's house. She might know perfectly well that she had done nothing wrong. She might also know that doing nothing wrong was not always enough. A man walking alone at dusk might be thought independent. A woman walking alone at dusk might be asked why. A man speaking privately with a woman might be thought bold. The woman might be thought compromised. The double standard was not hidden. It was built into the rules. A respectable woman learned to think about witnesses. Who can see me? Who can say where I was? Who will repeat this? who might misunderstand. That constant awareness shaped posture, timing, roots, friendships, and even feelings. Desire itself had to learn caution. Marriage ceremonies and the steps leading to them were also public for a reason. Banns might be read in church before marriage in many Protestant communities, announcing the intended union so objections could be raised. Licenses, parental consent, settlements, witnesses and ceremonies all made marriage a community-recognised event, rather than a private promise between lovers. The public nature of marriage protected property lines, inheritance, legitimacy, and social order. It also gave families and communities a final chance to interfere. If there was a prior promise, too close a kinship, lack of consent, religious objection, or suspicion of coercion, the matter could become public. Elopement existed naturally, and it carried the thrill and scandal that rule-breaking always carries. But even elopement depended on public recognition afterward. A couple could run away, but they could not live entirely outside community judgment unless they kept running. Not everyone was allowed the same kind of courtship. Enslaved people in many colonies formed partnerships, loved one another, created families, and held marriage rituals within their communities. But slave law often refused to recognize those marriages as legally binding against the power of owners. Husbands and wives could be sold apart. Children could be taken. The polite language of courtship and chaperonage does not capture that world, but it existed at the same time, in the same century, sometimes within sight of the grand houses where white daughters were guarded so carefully. Free black people, indigenous people, servants, the poor, religious minorities, and migrants all lived under different pressures and customs. Some communities had their own courtship practices. Some were forced to navigate laws designed to control whom they could marry. Interracial relationships, depending on colony or country, could be criminalized, stigmatized, or violently punished. So when we speak of courtship rules in the 1700s, we must remember that the rules were not one blanket laid evenly across society. They were layered. The higher and more property-conscious the family, the more formal the supervision might become. The more vulnerable the person, the less protection and respectability might offer. And yet, across many different lives, the same broad idea returns. Love was watched because love changed households. There is a quieter side to all this that deserves attention. Courtship under supervision could create a slow intimacy that modern people might find almost impossible. When a couple could not simply disappear together, they learned each other in fragments. A voice across a room, a choice of words in front of elders, patience with a younger sibling, a reaction to being contradicted, a manner towards servants, a willingness to work, a blush when teased, the careful return of a borrowed book, the steadiness of repeated visits, the fact that he came through bad weather, the fact that she remembered his mother was ill, the fact that neither rushed. Not all supervised courtship was cold. Sometimes the slow pace allowed trust to grow in public until private affection had a foundation. Sometimes families helped young people see what infatuation missed. Sometimes a watchful mother noticed cruelty before a daughter did. Sometimes a father's objection saved a child from hardship. The system could be controlling, but not every act of control was malicious. Many parents were afraid because they understood the cost of a bad marriage. Their methods could be severe, but their fear was not imaginary. A bad marriage in the 1700s was not easily escaped. Divorce was difficult, rare, expensive, legally complicated, or socially ruinous in many places. Separation could leave a woman economically vulnerable. Domestic cruelty might be hidden under household authority. A husband's debts could consume a wife's property. A wife's labour could be taken for granted until death. To marry was to enter a structure far harder to leave than most modern marriages, so courtship carried the weight of permanence. The question was not simply, do I like this person tonight? It was, Can I live under the consequences of this choice for the rest of my life? That is why a walk alone mattered. It could be the beginning of affection, or the beginning of a rumour that pushed affection faster than wisdom allowed. As evening comes on, imagine a young couple after a public gathering. Others are leaving, lanterns move, horses are being readied, cloaks are drawn tighter. There is confusion, the useful kind that lets people step slightly out of place. He offers to walk her a short distance. She wants to say yes. Perhaps she does say yes because the distance is small, because others are ahead, because it would be rude to refuse because she trusts him, because for once she would like to hear his voice without three relatives breathing over the conversation. They walk. Nothing happens. Maybe they speak of ordinary things. Maybe he says one sentence that makes his intentions clearer than they have ever been. Maybe she answers carefully. Maybe they are seen by someone at a window. By morning the story may be harmless. By morning it may also have grown. They walked alone. How far? How long? Did you see them? Was it dark? Did her mother know? Is he serious? Has he spoken to her father? The danger is not the walk. The danger is that the walk becomes public property. In that world, a private moment could be taken from you, almost as soon as it happened. That is the terror hidden inside the social rules of courtship. It is not only that young people were prevented from being alone, it is that they were rarely allowed to own the meaning of being alone. Other people claimed the right to interpret it. Family, neighbours, church, law and gossip all leaned in. Love had to negotiate with them. Sometimes it succeeded. Sometimes it bent. Sometimes it broke. Sometimes two people stood at an altar surrounded by everyone who had watched them arrive there, and the same community that had limited their privacy now confirmed their union. That public confirmation mattered. It turned watched glances, supervised visits, careful letters, accepted calls, family negotiations, and anxious restraint into a new household. The young woman who had been guarded became a wife. The young man who had been examined became a husband. The rules did not end. They changed shape. The woman's reputation now depended on being a good wife, a good manager, a faithful mother, a respectable neighbour. The man's reputation depended on governing the household, providing, behaving with honour, and not letting disorder attach itself to his name. Courtship was only the doorway. Marriage was the house beyond it. But before anyone steps through that doorway, there remains one more force waiting outside almost every home, church, market and parlour we have visited. It is the force that made the chaperone necessary, made clothing dangerous, made speech careful, made bowing visible, and made table order meaningful. It is the force of other people watching, judging, repeating, laughing, correcting, excluding and punishing, without always touching the law at all. A society this dependent on reputation needed ways to discipline anyone who stood out too sharply, broke the pattern too openly, or gave the neighbourhood too much to talk about. And in the 1700s, shame was not just a feeling inside the chest. It could be made public, loud, organised, and impossible to ignore. A society this dependent on reputation could not leave rule-breaking alone. That is the first thing to understand before we step into the harsher side of the 1700s. The rules around tables, speech, clothing, courtship, rank and respect did not survive merely because people politely agreed with them. They survived because communities enforced them. Sometimes enforcement came from law, with a constable, a court, a fine, a whipping post, a jail, a set of stocks in the market square, or a printed notice that named the offender in public. More often, enforcement began long before the law arrived. It began with a look across a churchyard. It began with two women speaking at the well. It began with a tavern story told 3 times in one evening. It began with someone saying, "Did you hear?" and another person leaning closer because of course they wanted to hear. In the 1700s, gossip was not a small background noise of community life. It was one of the main ways a town explained itself to itself. It told people who had behaved badly, who had married poorly, who was in debt, who drank too much, who spoke above their place, who dressed beyond their means, who might be pregnant before marriage, who cheated a customer, who neglected children, who failed to attend church, who argued with a husband, who beat a wife, who insulted a magistrate, who was seen in the wrong lane at the wrong hour, and who had become, for a little while or for the rest of life, a warning. Think about how narrow the world could be. A village, a market town, a parish, a colonial settlement, a neighbourhood along a road or river, a cluster of families who saw each other at church, traded with each other, borrowed tools from each other, married into each other, and needed each other when sickness, fire, birth, death, debt, hunger or winter came. In such a place, reputation was not an ornament. It was credit. It was marriageability. It was employability. It was trust. It was whether someone would lend you seed, take your son as an apprentice, hire your daughter as a maid, stand godparent to your child, believe your word in a dispute, or come when your roof burned. A person with a damaged name could still live, work, pray, and eat. But life became harder in ways that did not always show up in court records. Invitations stopped. Customers drifted away. Suitors disappeared. Neighbours became slower to help. A woman might notice that conversations changed when she approached. A man might find that people no longer trusted his accounts. A family might remain physically in the same house while becoming socially colder to everyone around it. That was punishment, even without a sentence. The danger of gossip was that it did not need to be fully true to be effective. It only needed to be believable. That is what made it so frightening. A young woman seen walking alone with a man could explain that nothing improper had happened, and she might be telling the complete truth. But the explanation had to travel after the rumour, and rumours are often faster than explanations. A tradesman accused of shaving weight from goods could swear he was honest, but the next customer might still hesitate. A servant accused of stealing ribbons might never prove otherwise if the mistress's word carried more weight. In a world where people relied heavily on personal testimony and communal memory, words could attach themselves to a person like burrs on wool. Some fell away, some stayed. Women were especially vulnerable to this kind of punishment because female reputation was tied so tightly to sexual conduct, modesty, household order and obedience. A man could be laughed at for drunkenness, debt, or foolish pride, and still recover if he had property, work, or useful connections. A woman called unchaste could face consequences that followed her into every possible future. Her marriage prospects could narrow. Her family could suffer embarrassment. Her employers, if she worked as a servant, might dismiss her. If she became pregnant outside marriage, the shame could become formal, visible, and economic. Communities worried about illegitimate children partly because of morality, and partly because someone had to pay for support. Parish authorities, church elders, and local courts often took intense interest in sexual behaviour, not because they were merely nosy, though many were, but because sexuality affected inheritance, poor relief, household, stability, and public order. A private act could become a public financial problem, and once that happened, shame had paperwork. Church discipline played a major role in many communities. In some Protestant areas, especially where church membership and local moral oversight were strong, people could be admonished, required to confess sins publicly, barred from communion, or made to stand before the congregation. The offence might be fornication, drunkenness, slander, Sabbath breaking, quarrels, neglect of worship, or some other behaviour that threatened the moral reputation of the community. To stand before neighbours and confess was not a symbolic inconvenience, it was a full-bodied humiliation. The person had to appear in the same sacred space where they hoped to be respected, and there, before people who knew their parents, spouse, children, debts and weaknesses, they had to acknowledge wrongdoing. The purpose, at least in theory, was repentance and restoration. The community did not always intend to destroy the offender. It often claimed to correct and bring the person back. But correction in public leaves a mark. Even when forgiveness was offered, memory remained seated in the pews. In some places, the architecture of shame was literal. Stocks, pillories, whipping posts, cages and public platforms stood in towns not only as tools of punishment, but as warnings. The stocks held the ankles, sometimes the wrists, leaving the offender seated or crouched in public view. The pillory held the head and hands upright through a wooden frame, forcing a person to stand exposed while the crowd looked, mocked, threw refuse, or simply remembered. These punishments were used for various offences depending on time and place: petty theft, fraud, drunkenness, disorderly conduct, libel, vagrancy, market violations, and other crimes thought suitable for public correction. The point was not only pain, though pain could certainly be part of it. The point was visibility. To be punished in the square was to become a lesson with a name and face. Children could be brought past and told to look. Adults could make comments. The body became a notice board. The pillory could be dangerous. Crowds were unpredictable. Some offenders were pelted with mud, rotten food, dead animals, stones, or worse. Others, if the crowd sympathised with them, might be treated gently or even cheered. That is an important detail because public shame depended on public agreement, and public agreement was not guaranteed. A printer punished for criticising an unpopular official might receive support from the crowd. A cheat who had harmed poor customers might receive rage. A person punished for religious or political reasons could become a martyr in the eyes of supporters. Public punishment gave authorities a stage, but once a crowd gathers, the crowd brings its own judgment. The square could reinforce power, or it could reveal resentment toward power. That made shame useful and risky. There were also punishments that marked the body more permanently. Branding, ear cropping in earlier periods and some places, whipping, and other physical penalties made crime visible through scars. By the 1700s, practices varied widely, and some older punishments were declining in some regions while remaining in others. But the idea that a body could carry legal memory was still present. A person who had been whipped publicly did not simply suffer in the moment. The story followed. A person known to have stood in the pillory could be identified years later through communal memory. Punishment worked by extending itself into reputation. Law and gossip cooperated. Printed shame grew more important as newspapers and pamphlets spread. A notice in a newspaper could name a runaway apprentice, an absconding servant, a debtor, a deserter, a thief, a person accused of fraud, or an enslaved person who had escaped. These notices often described clothing, bodily marks, speech, skills, and habits in detail. They were tools of control, and in the case of runaway slave advertisements, they were part of a violent system that tried to turn the public into a net. A person seeking freedom could be reduced in print to a list of identifying features and suspected routes. That kind of public notice shows the darker side of a society trained to read bodies. The same habits that let neighbours identify rank through dress could help authorities capture people trying to leave bondage or servitude. Public information was not neutral. It served whoever had the money and power to print and circulate it. At the level of village life, some of the strangest punishments were not official at all. Communities created rough rituals for shaming people who violated local expectations. In Britain and parts of colonial America, customs such as charivari, skimmington rides, rough music, or similar noisy processions could be used to mock households thought to have inverted proper order, especially where a wife was believed to dominate a husband. A husband was thought to be beaten by his wife, a sexual scandal had occurred, or someone had behaved in a way the community found disgraceful. The details varied. People might gather with pots, pans, horns, bells, and rough instruments, making a terrible noise outside the offender's home. Effigies might be carried. A man might be paraded backward on an animal. Songs or rhymes might be shouted. The crowd might laugh, jeer, bang, and refuse to let the household ignore the judgment. It sounds almost ridiculous until you imagine being inside the house. The darkness outside, the crash of metal, neighbours shouting your private humiliation into the night, children frightened, servants listening, the whole street knowing exactly why the noises come. This was shame made audible. These rituals tell us something uncomfortable about community. People did not only enforce laws from above, they enforced expectations from beside and below. Neighbours punished neighbours. People who had little formal power could still join a crowd and make life unbearable for someone who had broken a local norm. Sometimes the target may have genuinely harmed others. Sometimes the target may simply have failed to fit the community's idea of order. A woman with a sharp tongue, a man considered weak, a couple whose marriage did not match expected gender roles, a suspected adulterer, a miser, a cheat, a scold, a person who violated sexual norms. Any of these could become the centre of rough public theatre. The crowd claimed to defend morality, but crowds also enjoy permission to be cruel. That was true then, and it remains true now. The label of scold shows how gendered shame could be. A woman who quarrelled too openly, insulted neighbours, shouted in the street, challenged authority, or refused the quietness expected of her could be treated as a public nuisance. The old image of the ducking stool, where women accused of scolding or disorderly speech were fastened to a chair and plunged into water, belongs more strongly to earlier centuries and was not common everywhere in the 1700s. But the memory and occasional use of such punishments reveal a wider attitude. Women's voices could be treated as dangerous when they disturbed male authority or neighbourhood peace. Men fought, cursed, drank, and slandered too. Yet women's disorderly speech carried a special social sting because it violated the ideal of female modesty. A loud man could be rough, a loud woman could be unnatural. That difference mattered. Men faced shame through failures of honour, independence, authority, and credit. A man who could not pay debts might be publicly named, sued, imprisoned, or avoided. Debt was not only financial, it was moral in many eyes. A debtor could be seen as irresponsible, dishonest, or weak, even when circumstances were beyond his control. A man whose wife was believed to rule him might be mocked. A man who failed to discipline children or servants might be judged incapable. A cowardly act, a public insult left unanswered, a drunken collapse, a dishonest bargain, or a failure to provide could damage masculine reputation. For men of higher status, honour was especially sensitive. They guarded names, titles, and public respect with intensity. For poorer men, reputation for honest work could be the difference between employment and hunger. Shame wore different clothes depending on class, but it visited every rank. Children learned the power of shame early. A child corrected in front of visitors felt not only parental displeasure, but public exposure. Schools use shame as discipline. A lazy, disobedient, or slow pupil might be made to stand apart, wear a sign, sit in a low place, be mocked, or endure punishment before others. Apprentices could be shamed by masters. Servants could be scolded in front of households. Public correction taught obedience through embarrassment. The modern instinct to protect a child's inner dignity was not absent in every family, but it was not the guiding rule in the same way. Many adults believed shame could form character. A child who felt disgrace might learn not to repeat the offence. That was the argument. Whether the child learned virtue, fear, resentment, or secrecy depended on the child and the severity of the adults. Markets had their own public punishments, because market trust mattered. Selling bad bread, short weight, watered goods, spoiled meat, false measures, or fraudulent wares could lead to fines, exposure, destruction of goods, or public humiliation. A baker who cheated customers was not only breaking a rule, he was attacking the daily trust that allowed people to buy food from one another. In some places, dishonest merchants or tradespeople could be displayed with their false goods, or punished in ways that connected the offence to the shame. The community wanted people to see that cheating had consequences. Again, the body became a message. The offender stood where customers could look and remember. The strange thing is that shame could be both brutal and practical. In a world without modern policing, surveillance and bureaucracy, communities needed ways to enforce trust. If someone cheated, lied, stole, seduced, slandered or disrupted peace, the law might be slow, distant, expensive or unavailable. Reputation moved faster. Shame warned others. Gossip spread risk information. Public punishment made consequences visible. A woman telling another woman that a certain man was not to be trusted might be protecting her. A neighbour warning that a tradesman gave short measure might save money for the poor. A church publicly correcting a man for drunken violence might pressure him to change. Not all gossip was malicious. Not all shame was pointless. Communities used these tools because they had few others. But the same tools could also crush people unfairly. Gossip can protect, and gossip can lie. Shame can correct, and shame can destroy. A person who was different, poor, mentally ill, sexually vulnerable, foreign, religiously dissenting, racially marginalized, disabled, or simply disliked, could become a target more easily than someone powerful. Public opinion tends to strike hardest at those least able to answer it. A wealthy man's scandal might be softened by connections. A poor woman's scandal might define her life. A gentleman's debt might be renegotiated. A labourer's debt might bring ruin. A son of a respected family might be forgiven for youthful wildness. A servant girl might be dismissed for one rumour. This unevenness is essential. The rules claimed to defend order, but order often meant protecting the comfort and authority of those already higher in the room. Public shame also depended on memory. In small communities, people remembered what your parents had done, what your brother had been accused of, who your mother quarrelled with, whether your uncle drank, whether your family had once needed poor relief, whether your sister's courtship ended badly, whether your father had failed in business, whether your grandmother had been proud, whether your children were noisy in church. A family could inherit reputation like a patched coat. It might be useful, burdensome, unfair, or all three. This is one reason people worked so hard to maintain respectability. They were not only guarding themselves, they were guarding the family name as a shared shelter. Tear it badly enough, and everyone inside felt the weather. The fear of standing out shaped behaviour in subtle ways. People avoided clothing that would attract criticism. They softened speech in front of superiors. They kept courtship visible enough to be respectable. They attended church even when tired. They corrected children in public because uncorrected children made parents look weak. They accepted invitations they did not want, returned visits on time, offered condolences properly, mourned visibly, paid debts as best they could, and tried not to let private disorder leak into public view. This did not mean everyone was obedient. Far from it. The 1700s were full of scandal, drunkenness, elopement, smuggling, political rebellion, sexual misconduct, fraud, satire, rough crowds, and ordinary human stubbornness. But even rebellion needed to understand the rules it broke. Standing out had power because fitting in had been demanded so strongly. There is a quiet scene worth holding for a moment. A woman steps into the churchyard on Sunday morning. She knows there has been talk about her household. Perhaps her husband has debt. Perhaps her daughter was seen too often with a certain man. Perhaps she herself argued loudly with a neighbour over a boundary, a pig, a borrowed pot, a missing cloth, something small enough to sound foolish and serious enough to damage peace. She is dressed carefully. Her cap is clean. Her face is composed. She greets people with measured politeness. She cannot force them to forget, but she can show that she knows how to behave. That is one way people survived shame. They returned to the places where they were known and performed order again. Respectability could be rebuilt through repetition. Show up, dress properly, speak calmly, attend worship, pay what you owe, keep children neat, avoid giving new material to the old talk. Time might soften the story. It might not erase it, but it could bury it under newer stories about someone else. That is another thing about gossip. It hungers constantly. A community that talks about you today may talk about another person tomorrow. This was both cruel and merciful. Shame could feel endless while it lasted, but attention moved. The birth, the fire, the theft, the wedding, the arrest, the strange stranger at the inn, the price of wheat, the minister's sermon, the widow's new gown, the apprentice who ran away, the girl who received a letter, the man who shouted in the tavern. The scandal shifted. To survive sometimes meant waiting until the town found a new subject. People have always known this, even without saying it plainly. Public executions, though more severe than ordinary social shame, also belong to this world of punishment as spectacle. In many parts of the 18th century, executions were public events. Crowds gathered. Sermons might be preached. Broadsides might be printed with confessions or moral lessons. The condemned person was turned into an example at the edge of death. Authorities hoped the sight would deter crime and reinforce moral order. Crowds came for many reasons: fear, curiosity, duty, entertainment, pity, anger, religious concern. The line between justice and spectacle was not always clear. A hanging was meant to show the power of law, but it also exposed society's appetite for watching punishment. The same culture that demanded modesty at table could bring children to see a body die in public. This contradiction can disturb us, but it made sense to many people then. They believed punishment should be seen because sin and crime harmed the community. The community therefore witnessed the consequence. Not all public shame came from official punishment or moral scandal. Satire was another weapon. The 1700s loved satire. Prints, pamphlets, songs, poems, plays, jokes, caricatures, and nicknames could damage public figures and private people alike. A ridiculous image of a politician, a fashionable fool, a greedy merchant, a vain woman, a quack doctor, or a corrupt official could travel widely. Laughter was a form of judgment. To be laughed at publicly was to lose control over one's own image. Satire could challenge power, which made it valuable. It could also reinforce prejudice, cruelty, and social boundaries. A caricature of a macaroni mocked male fashion excess. A print of a scolding wife mocked gender disorder. A pamphlet attacking a public figure could expose corruption, or exaggerate it beyond fairness. The 1700s understood that ridicule could punish where law could not reach. For those who lived under racial slavery, public shame operated differently because the law and society denied basic personhood while still imposing forced codes of behaviour. Enslaved people could be punished publicly for resistance, escape attempts, theft, speech, movement, or simply defiance as defined by owners and authorities. These punishments were not about restoring equal community order. They were about terror and control. At the same time, enslaved communities had their own internal systems of reputation, respect, faith, kinship, and judgment, often hidden from enslavers. A person could be shamed by the people who claimed ownership, and also honoured by the community that knew the truth of their courage. That distinction matters. Public punishment by the powerful does not tell us the whole moral meaning of an act. A runaway labelled criminal in a newspaper may have been understood by others as brave. A person punished for insolence may have been asserting dignity. Shame is not always accepted by the one it is aimed at. Religious dissenters, political radicals, and reformers also show how standing out could become either disgrace or honour, depending on who did the judging. A Quaker refusing hat honour might be seen by some as disrespectful and by others as faithful. A printer punished for a seditious publication might be condemned by authorities and admired by readers. A woman who spoke too boldly in a religious meeting might be dismissed as disorderly in one community and revered in another. Shame depends on the values of the audience. Change the audience, and the same act changes meaning. That is how societies shift. At first, someone stands out and is punished. Later, others decide that the person was not shameful after all. The 1700s, full of revolutions and reform movements, saw many old gestures of deference questioned in exactly this way. Still, for most ordinary people, the safest path was not heroic defiance. It was careful conformity. Keep your clothing believable. Keep your children respectful. Keep your courtship witnessed. Keep your debts quiet if you can. Keep your temper in public. Keep your body in the right place. Keep your words measured. Keep your household from becoming a story. That last rule may be the most honest one. Do not become a story. In a small community, becoming a story meant losing control. Others would choose the beginning, middle, and moral. They would decide whether you were foolish, wicked, pitiable, proud, ridiculous, ruined, or forgiven. They would tell it while kneading bread, mending stockings, shoeing horses, drinking ale, waiting after church, carrying water, or sitting by the fire. Once your name entered that kind of circulation, you could not easily call it back. And yet people did stand out. They loved the wrong person. They wore the bright ribbon. They argued with the magistrate. They refused the bull. They printed the pamphlet. They kept the hat on. They ran away. They married without permission. They laughed too loudly. They spoke the truth badly. They cheated and were caught. They sinned and confessed. They were falsely accused and endured. They survived the pillory, the church rebuke, the rough music, the whispers, the cold looks, the printed notice, the family anger. Some were broken by shame. Some were corrected by it. Some became harder, quieter, more careful. Some left town. Some waited until a new scandal replaced them. Some discovered that the fear of public opinion was worse than the punishment itself. Human beings in the 1700s were as varied as we are. The rules were strict, but life was always leaking through them. By now, the strange social rules of that century begin to look less like a collection of quaint customs and more like a complete system. The table taught rank. Speech tested restraint. Bowing and curtsying mapped respect. Clothing made identity visible. Courtship placed desire under supervision. Gossip and public shame enforced the borders. Every piece supported the others. If you dressed above your place, people talked. If you spoke above your place, people corrected you. If you courted outside the rules, people watched you. If you ignored public gestures of respect, people remembered. If you broke the moral code too visibly, the church, court, crowd, or neighbourhood might make you answer for it. The result was a society where the individual was never entirely alone, even in private feeling. Other people were always present as imagined witnesses. There is comfort in our distance from some of that world. Most of us do not fear the stocks in the market square. Most of us do not expect a minister to make us confess before the whole congregation. Many of us can marry for love, dress across class lines, speak to employers with a freedom that would have shocked earlier generations, and walk alone without assuming the town has a right to interpret us. These freedoms matter. They were not always available, and they are still not evenly available everywhere, but the old world has not vanished as completely as we might think. We still fear becoming a story. We still know the force of public laughter. We still watch clothes, speech, posture, relationships and mistakes. We still punish people with exclusion, rumour, screenshots, comments, silence and memory. Our pillories are different. The square is brighter now, wider, faster, and often carried in the hand. But the human appetite to judge, warn, mock, correct, and belong to the judging crowd is very old. That is why the 1700s can feel close when we look at public shame. The tools were different. The stocks, the church pew, the market square, the tavern song, the whispered reputation, the noisy procession under the window. But the feeling underneath is recognisable. The sudden awareness that others are talking, the heat in the face, the wish to explain, the knowledge that explanation may only feed the story, the small discipline of appearing in public again anyway, the hope that time will move on, the need to be seen behaving properly after being seen, or imagined behaving badly. People in the 1700s lived with that pressure in a world where reputation could decide whether they ate, married, worked, borrowed, traded, or belonged. They learned the rules because the rules were everywhere, and they feared shame because shame could reach places law never touched. So imagine one last evening in that town. The market square is emptying. The stocks stand unused for now, dark wood against the fading light. A few people linger near a shop door, speaking quietly about someone not present. A mother pulls a child away before the child hears too much. A servant carries news back to a kitchen. A gentleman adjusts his coat and pretends not to notice a stare. A young woman crosses the street with her eyes lowered because she knows she was seen yesterday. A man who has been mocked in the tavern walks home by a side lane. In one house, a family sits at supper, careful as ever about place and speech. In another, a girl folds away a ribbon she has decided not to wear. Somewhere, a young man considers whether to apologise before a joke becomes an insult. Somewhere else, a widow chooses how long to keep wearing black. The whole town is holding itself together with rules, and every person inside it knows in some private part of the mind that to live among others is to be read by them. The 1700s did not hide that truth. It built a world out of it. One bow, one whisper, one seat, one sleeve, one watched doorway, and one remembered mistake at a time.